Chapter 17 of Interrupted by Pansy. Chapter 17 Spreading Nets. The morning found her own quiet self. Her first waking thoughts were of Bud, and the first thing she did, after her toilet was made, was to sit down and study her Bible with a view to selecting some verses that she meant to mark for Bud. All day she went about her many duties with a quiet heart. Even the sting of a false friendship seemed to have been taken away. In the afternoon she refused to ride with Mr. Ansted, on the plea that she had a music lesson to give, but when the scholar failed to appear, she, in nowise discomfited, set herself to the answering of the home letters. A long, genial letter to her mother, longer than she had taken time for of late, fuller of detail as to the work that occupied hands and heart. Something about Bud, his lonely life, his one tender memory, her desire that he might find a friend who would never fail him, her wish that the mother would remember him when she prayed, her longing to be in a faint sense a helper to him, as her father would surely have been, were he on the earth. "I cannot do for him what papa would," so she wrote, "but Christ can do much more, and it gives me a thrill of joy to remember that he is not only in heaven with papa, but here watching over Bud." A detailed account of the last evening's rehearsal and the new recruits, a hint of her desire to lead this restless Alice into clearer light, if indeed the true light had ever shined into her heart. A word even about Louis Ansted. Would mamma pray for him too? It was said that he was in danger from several sources, and he said that his mother was not at all anxious about him. If you were his mother, so she wrote, you would be anxious. Be a mother to him for Christ's sake, mamma dear, and pray for him, as I am afraid his own mother does not. Still, I ought not to say that, for she is a member of the church, and it may be that her son does not know her heart. To Dora there was but a scrap of paper. "It is a pity, Doralinda dear, to put you off with this little torn bit of paper, but I have written all the news to mamma, which means to you too, of course, and this bit is just large enough for the subject about which I want to speak to you alone. Don't worry, little sister, about me, nor about Pierce Douglass's treatment of me or of you. If his manliness can afford such a slight as he gave you, we certainly can afford to bear it. In a sense it was hard, but much harder, I should think, for him than for us. No, little Dora, the church here has not my whole heart, though I will own that a large piece of it has gone out to the dreary little sanctuary so sadly in need of a human friend. For the Lord will not do what his people ought to do, you know. But I will tell you who is filling my heart and keeping me at rest and happy, the Lord Jesus Christ. Not happy without papa, but happy in the hope of meeting him again, and never parting any more. Don't you remember, dear, there can never be another parting from papa? Some sorrowful places there may be for your feet and mine on our journey home, but so far as papa is concerned, there will be no more need for tears. Bear the thorns of the way, little sister, in patience, for they are only on the way through the woods, not a thorn in the home. I trust you will be so brave as to dismiss Pierce Douglass from your thoughts, unless, indeed, you will take the trouble to ask him for what he will let us have some handsome chairs for the pulpit. I remember at this moment that his money is invested in furniture. But perhaps you will not like to do that, and he might not let us have them at any lower rates than we could secure elsewhere. Good-bye, darling, brave, lonely sister. I both laughed and cried over your letter, though the tears were not about the things you thought would move them." She folded and addressed this letter with a smile. No need to tell this sensitive, fierce-hearted Dora that the wound rankled for a time, and did not bring tears only because it was too deep for tears. Yet assuredly her heart was not broken over Pierce Douglass. The letter sealed and laid aside, an unemployed half-hour lay before her. Not that there was not plenty to do, but that curious aversion to setting about any of it, which busy workers so well understand, came over her in full force. A sort of unreasonable and unreasoning desire that the hour might be marked by something special hovered around her. She stood at the window and looked out on the snow, and watched the sleighs fly past. A sleigh ride would be pleasant. Why could she not have known that her music scholar was to disappoint her, and so had the benefit of a ride? Possibly she might have said a word in season to Louis Ansted, though there was about her the feeling that he was not ready for the word in season, and would make poor use of it. Perhaps the master knew that it was better left unsaid, and so had held her from the opportunity. But she longed to do something. A sleigh was stopping at the academy. The young man who sprang out and presently pealed the bell was Harry Matthews. Did he want her, she wondered, and was this her special opportunity? No, he only wanted a roll of music, to study the part which he was to sing. But on learning that the teacher was in, and at leisure, he came to her in the music room, and asked questions about this particular song, and about the rehearsal, and asked to have the tenor played for him, and as he bent forward to turn the music, the breath of wine floated distinctly to her. Was this an opportunity? Was there something that she might say and ought to say? It was Louis Ansted's belief that this young man's special danger lay in this direction. But what a delicate direction it was to touch! He thanked her heartily for the help which she had given him about the difficult part, and in that brief time her resolution was taken. "Now, do you know there is something that I want you to do for me?" No, he did not know it, but was delighted to hear it. Miss Benedict was doing so much for them all, that it would certainly be a great pleasure to feel that he could in any way serve her. He wished he could tell her how much he and some of the other boys appreciated this opportunity to study music. There had never been any good singing in South Plains before. There was a flush on Claire's cheeks as she replied, holding forward a little book at the same time. It would serve me. She could think of scarcely anything else, so easily done, that would give her greater pleasure than to have him write his name on her pledge book. She had an ambition to fill every blank. There was room for 500 signers, and she and her sister at home were trying to see which could get their pledge book filled first. Would he give her his name? And so, to his amazement and dismay, was Harry Matthews brought face to face with a total abstinence pledge. What an apparently simple request to make! How almost impossible it seemed to him to comply with it! He made no attempt to take the little book, but stood in embarrassment before it. "Isn't there anything else?" he said at last, trying to laugh. "I hadn't an idea that you would ask anything of this sort. I can't sign it, Miss Benedict. I can't really, though I would like to please you." "What is in the way, Mr. Matthews? Have you promised your mother not to sign it?" The flush on his cheek mounted to his forehead, but still he tried to laugh and speak gaily. "Hardly. My mother's petitions do not lie in that direction. But I really am principled against signing pledges. I don't believe in a fellow making a coward of himself and hanging his manhood on a piece of paper." This was foolish. Would it do to let the young fellow know that she knew it was? "Then you do not believe in bonds, or mortgages, or receipts, or promises to pay of any sort? Not even bank notes?" He laughed again. "That is business," he said. "Well," briskly, "this is business. I will be very businesslike. What do you want me to do, give you a receipt? Come, I want your name to help fill my book, and I am making as earnest a business as I know how of securing names." "Miss Benedict, I am not in the least afraid of becoming a drunkard." "Mr. Matthews, that has nothing whatever to do with the business at hand. What I want is your name on my total abstinence pledge. If you do not intend to be a drinker, you can certainly have no objection to gratifying me in this way." "Ah, but I have." The promise trammels me unnecessarily and foolishly. I am often thrown among people with whom it is pleasant to take a sip of wine, and it does no harm to anybody." "How can you be sure of that? There are drunkards in the world, Mr. Matthews. Is it your belief that they started out with the deliberate intention of becoming such, or even with the fear that they might? Or were they led along step by step?" "Oh, I know all that, but I assure you I am very careful with whom I drink liquor. There are people who seem unable to take a very little habitually. They must either let it alone or drink to excess. Such people ought to let it alone and to sign a pledge to do so. I never drink with any such; and I never drink, anyway, save with men much older than I, who ought to set me the example instead of looking to me, and who are either masters of themselves or too far gone to be influenced by anything that I might do." Was there ever such idiotic reasoning? But the young man before her was very young, and did not know his own heart, much less understand human nature. He was evidently in earnest, and would need any amount of argument, would need, indeed, a much better knowledge of himself, before she could convince him of his false and dangerous position, and her opportunity, if it were one, was swiftly passing. What was there that she could accomplish here and now? Since he was in such a state of bewilderment as to logic, she resolved to lay a delicate little snare for his feet. "Well, I am sorry that you will not sign my pledge. I do not like your arguments. I think they are painfully weak. I wish at your leisure you would look into them carefully, and see if you think them worthy of lodgment in an honest mind. But in the meantime there is something else. This little favor that I am about to ask, will you promise to grant?" The man looked immensely relieved. He had not expected her to abandon the ground so promptly. He had been on the verge of pleading fear lest his horse was restive, and so breaking away from the embarrassment. He tumbled eagerly into the pretty net. What could she ask that would not be easy enough, now that the total abstinence pledge was out of the way? He could think of nothing else that a lady such as Miss Benedict certainly was, could ask, which would not be comparatively easy of accomplishment. "I don't believe in that way of doing business," he said, looking wise, and smiling down on her in a superior way. "As a rule, I promise nothing with my eyes shut; but I am sure to be able to trust you, and I will try to do anything else that you ask of me, if only to prove how sincere I am in my desire to please." "It is a very good rule as a rule," she said quickly. "I would not violate it often, but this is easy enough to do. I want your signature to that." She turned the leaves rapidly, and pointed to a few lines in the back part of the little book. 2 signatures were appended, but the astounding words that arrested the young man's attention were these: "I promise that within 24 hours after I have taken a taste of anything that will intoxicate, I will report the same, either in person or by letter, to my friend, Miss Benedict." The hot blood spread all over the face of the gay boy before her, as he read and reread this singular pledge. "I am fairly caught," he said at last, in a constrained voice, "and in a way that I least expected. May I ask you what possible good it can do you to burden yourself with such senseless confidences as these?" "You are right," she said. "They are confidences. I should not have shown you the book if I were not sure that the names there are utterly unknown to you, and will be likely always to remain so. I had a good motive, and the effort resulted in good. So much you must believe on trust. But I did not mean to catch you, at least not in the way you mean, and to prove it, I will release you from your promise. I judged from what you told me that you would not consider it a hard one." She was speaking with cold dignity now. She was willing that he should not sign this pledge if he wished to be released. If only his unwillingness to sign would lead him to think on what dangerous ground he stood, part of her object would have been attained. But no, his pride was roused now, and came to the rescue. He refused to be released. Since she chose to burden herself in this way, he was quite willing, and should certainly add his name. This he did, with a flourish, trying to be gay again, and went away assuring her that he was sorry for her, for he always kept a pledge. After he was gone, she tormented herself as to whether she had done wisely. She was more than doubtful. Those 2 other names had been written by friendless and sorely tempted boys, who distrusted themselves and their resolution to such an extent that she had devised this little plan for helping them up from the depths of despair. They were gone now, both of them, where stronger arms than hers upheld them, where they were forever safe from falling. And Harry Matthews' knowledge of their names would harm no one. But Harry was of a different world. Had she been foolish in thus almost stealing his promise? He had not taken it as she thought he would. She had believed him to be gaily indifferent to his habits in this direction. She had believed that he was unaware how frequently he accepted business invitations of this character. On the whole, she was more than doubtful as to the unusual work done in this leisure half-hour, and looked with apprehension rather than pleasure at the name in her book. Nevertheless, she prayed over it as she had been wont to do for those who were gone now. There was nothing for it but to ask him who never made mistakes to overrule hers if it was a mistake, and to use it in some way for his glory. This rested her. It was so wonderful to remember that he could make even mistakes serve him. Meantime, Bud. The little lamp which belonged to his quarters over the stable was left wholly to his care, and he did not get the best. He often stumbled his way to bed in the dark, rather than take the trouble of filling the lamp in the daytime. But tonight, with his treasure under his arm, he rejoiced to remember that part of his morning work had been to fill that lamp and put it in unusual order. It was with satisfaction that he lighted and set it on the inverted barrel that he had improvised for a table. He was to read a verse in a book! He had little knowledge as to whether the verses were long or short, whether it would take till midnight or longer to read one, and it had nothing to do with his promise. He reflected that the lamp was full, and resolved that as long as it would burn, he would work at the verse, if necessary. But where to begin? What a big book it was! If Claire had but marked a verse for him as she had planned! Well, what then? It would not have been likely to have been the one over which he stopped at random, and slowly spelled out, going back over each word, until he had the complete sentence. As one whom his mother comforteth, so will I comfort you, and ye shall be comforted in Jerusalem. What a verse for poor, ignorant, blundering Bud! Might it not as well have been in Greek? End of chapter 17. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 18 of Interrupted by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. Bud in Search of Comfort. Let me tell you that sentences which you believe will be as Greek to certain souls are sometimes fraught with wonderful meaning, because of an illumination about which you know nothing. It was so with Bud. Back in his memory of those bright days when little Jack was still in the flesh, were certain scenes standing out vividly. Little Jack had a mother, a good, fat, motherly, commonplace sort of woman, with no knowledge of or care for Bud, beyond the fact that she wanted him always to have enough to eat and a comfortable place in which to sleep, and was glad that little Jack liked him so well, simply because it was a liking that gave little Jack pleasure. This was all that she would have been to you, but to Bud she would have served for his ideal of an angel, had he known anything about angels. She was little Jack's mother, and she was motherly, and Bud had never seen a motherly woman before. Perhaps, after all, you get an idea of why she was glorified in his eyes. His own mother slept in a neglected grave when Bud was 5 years old, but after he came to live at little Jack's, He had lain awake nights to think how she would have looked and acted and spoken had she been alive. And she always looked to him like this one motherly pattern. How Bud longed for her, for the sound of her voice, for the touch of her hand, only he could have told you. Little Jack had been in the habit of running to mother with every disappointment, every grievance, every pain. He had never been a healthy, rollicking, self-reliant boy, but a gentle, tender one, to be shielded and petted. And Bud had heard again and again and again these words, spoken oh so tenderly, that the memory of them now often brought the tears. "Poor little Jack! Mother will comfort him." And the words were accompanied with a gesture that framed itself in Bud's heart, the enveloping of little Jack's frail form within two strong motherly arms, suggestive to the boy of boundless power and protectiveness. Could words better fitted to meet Bud's heart have been marked in his Bible? Would Claire Benedict have been likely to have marked that particular verse for him? It is a truth that a certain class of Christian workers need to ponder deeply, that when we have done our best, according to the measure of our opportunities, we may safely leave the Holy Spirit to supplement our work. The next morning, Bud thoughtfully rubbed the shining coats of the horses, his mind awake and busy with a new problem. What did the verse mean that he had read so many times that now it seemed to glow before him on the sun-lighted snow? He had wakened in the night and wondered. What could it mean? Not that he did not understand some of it. He was too unenlightened to imagine that plain words could mean other than they did. It had not so much as occurred to him that, because they were in the Bible, they must necessarily have some obscure meaning utterly foreign to what they appeared to say. Such logic as that is only the privilege of certain of the educated classes. Bud knew then what some of the sentence meant. Somebody was to be comforted by somebody, and the way it was to be done was as a mother would do, and Bud, because of little Jack in heaven, knew how that was. Oh, little Jack, living your short and uneventful life here below, and oh, commonplace, yes, somewhat narrow-minded mother, bestowing only the natural instincts of the mother heart on your boy. Both of you were educating a soul for the King's palace, and you knew it not. How wonderful will the revelations of heaven be, when certain whose lives have touched for a few days and then separated, shall meet, in some of the cycles of eternity, and talk things over. Who but the Maker of human hearts could have planned Bud's education in this way? Well, he knew another thing. The Comforter promised must be Jesus, for had not she, the only other one who had spoken to him in disinterested kindness, said that Jesus, the same Jesus who had been so much to little Jack, was waiting for him, and wanted him to come up to heaven where Jack was? And if Jesus could do such great things for Jack, and really wanted him, could not he plan the way? Bud believed it. To be shown the way to reach such a place as Jack told of, and to be made ready to enter there when he should reach the door, would certainly be comfort enough. He could almost imagine that one saying to the little Hertz by the way, "Never mind, Bud, it will be all right by and by." That was what the mother used cheerily to say sometimes to little Jack, and the verse read, "As one whom his mother comforteth." You see how the photographs of his earlier years were educating Bud. But there was one thing shrouded in obscurity. This comforting was to be done at Jerusalem. Now what and where was Jerusalem? Poor Bud! He had never had no book, you will remember, and his knowledge of geography was limited indeed. He knew that this village which had almost bounded his life was named South Plains. And he knew that back in the country among the farms was where little Jack had lived, and he knew the name of the city that lay in the opposite direction. None of these were Jerusalem. Bud did not know, however, but that the next city, or town, or even farming region might answer to that name, and might be the spot to which those who would have comfort were directed. Little Jack might have lived there for aught that he knew. They came from some other place to the farm. Miss Benedict might be from there, in which case she would know how to direct him. I want you to take special notice of one thing. It lay clear as sunlight in the boy's ignorant mind. To Jerusalem he meant to go. And as to time, just as soon as he possibly could, he should start. As to how he should manage by the way, or what he should do after he reached that country, he made no speculations. The road was too dark for that. All that he was sure of was that he would start. "I wouldn't miss of little Jack for anything," he said, rubbing with energy. "And as for the comforting, if that can be for me, and she said so, why, I'd go till I dropped to find it." A clear voice broke in on his thoughts. "Bud, Mama wants the light carriage and the pony to be ready to take her to the 12:20 train." "Yes'm," said Bud, and he had as yet not a thought of saying anything else. But Miss Alice lingered and watched the rubbing. Not that she was interested in that, or indeed was thinking about it at all. She was watching Bud and thinking of him. What did Claire Benedict find in him to interest her? What did she suppose that she, Alice Ansted, could do to help him? The idea seemed fully as absurd as it had when first suggested. As if the boy had an idea above the horse he was rubbing so carefully. He did not look as intelligent as the animal. She had often wondered what the horses thought about as they trotted along. What did Bud think about as he rubbed? Did he think at all? "You seem to like that work?" It was Miss Alice's voice again. It startled Bud, the tone was so gentle, as though possibly she might be saying the words to comfort him. He dropped the brush with which he had been working, but as he stooped to pick it up, answered respectfully, "Yes, ma'am." Alice's lip curled. The idea of Miss Benedict trying to interest her in a boor like that, who could not reply to the merest commonplace without growing red in the face and blundering over his work! She turned to go. She could not think of anything else to say, and if she could, what use to say it? But in that one moment of time, Bud had taken his resolution. The voice had been kind. Its echo lingered pleasantly. He would summon all his courage and ask the question which was absorbing his thoughts. It might be days before he could see Miss Benedict again, and he could not wait. "Miss Ansted," he said, and she noticed that his voice trembled, "would you tell me one thing that I want to know right away?" "That depends," she answered lightly. "I may not know. However, if your question is not too deep, I may try to answer it. What do you want?" "Why, I've got to know right away where Jerusalem is." "Jerusalem?" she repeated. "Why on earth do you wish to know that? I don't know myself, precisely. It is across the ocean somewhere in Asia, you know. Why do you care, Bud, where it is?" "I've got to go there," said Bud, with simple dignity. Miss Ansted's laugh rang out merrily. "That is an undertaking," she said gaily. "When do you intend to start? And what is the object of the journey, I wonder?" She felt sure now that Bud was little less than an idiot. But Bud had another question to ask. His face was grave, almost dismayed. Across the ocean. That sentence appalled. He had heard of the ocean, and of a storm on it and a shipwreck. A wandering sailor once told in his hearing a fearful story of wreck and peril. Yet, be it recorded that the boy, though appalled, did not for one moment recede from his fixed resolve to start, and go as far as he could. That comforter he meant to find. It had taken such hold of his heart that he knew he could never give it up again. This was his next timidly put question. "Did you ever go there, Miss Ansted?" "I never did," she answered, laughing still, and very curious now to know what queer project poor Bud had on his mind. "Why do you want to go, Bud?" The answer was direct and grave. I want to go after him who said he would comfort me. Ye shall be comforted in Jerusalem, that is what it says. And she said it meant me, and little Jack went, I make sure, and mean to go. I must go. But before that answer Alice Ansted stood dumb. She had never been so amazed in her life. What did the fellow mean? What could have so completely turned his foolish brain? If this is the outcome of Miss Benedict's efforts, she ought to know it at once, before the poor idiot concludes his career in a lunatic asylum. This was her rapid thought, but aloud she said at last, I don't know what you are talking about, Bud. You have some wild idea that does not seem to be doing you any good. I would advise you to drop it and think about the horses. They are your best friends. I can't drop it, said Bud simply. I read the verse in the Bible. I promised I would, and I did, and I know all about it, and I want to have it. She said it was for me. What is the verse? And Miss Alice sat down on the carriage stool to listen. Bud repeated with slow and solemn emphasis the words which were now so familiar to his ear. As one whom his mother comforteth, so will I comfort you, and ye shall be comforted in Jerusalem. I know about mothers, he explained. There was little Jack's mother, and she used to say to him just that, Mother will comfort you, and she did. And this one I make sure is Jesus, because she said he wanted me to go to where little Jack is, and I guess he means me, because I feel as if he did, and I'm going to Jerusalem, if it is across 2 oceans. Evidently his heart gathered strength as he talked. His voice grew firmer, and the dignity of a fixed resolve began to settle on his face. Was there ever a more bewildered young lady than this one who sat on the carriage stool? She surveyed Bud with a sort of half-curious, half-frightened air, which she might have bestowed on a mild maniac whose wanderings interested her. What was she to say to him? How convince him of his queer mistake? That doesn't mean what you think it does, Bud, she began at last. Why doesn't it? Bud asked quickly, almost as one would speak who was holding on to a treasure which another was trying to snatch from him. Because it doesn't. It has nothing to do with the city named Jerusalem. It is about something that you don't understand. It has a spiritual meaning, and of course you don't understand what I mean by that. I haven't the least idea how to explain it to you, and indeed it is extremely unnecessary for you to know. You see, Bud, it means something entirely beyond your comprehension, and has nothing whatever to do with you. Bud made not the slightest attempt at answer, but went stolidly on with his work, and Alice sat still and surveyed him for a few minutes longer, then arose and shook out her robes and said, So I hope you will not start for Jerusalem yet awhile, and laughed and sped through the great sliding doors and picked her way daintily back to luxury, leaving the world blank for Bud. Miss Ansted was wise about the world and about books. Surely she would know whether the verse meant him, and whether the word Jerusalem meant Jerusalem. Was it all a mistake? The pony was brought forward now, and had her share of rubbing and careful handling, and a bit of petting now and then, though the conversation which generally went on between her and the worker was omitted this morning. Bud had graver thoughts. While he worked, he went over the old memories. Little Jack and the comforting mother, and the facts connected with those experiences, no need to tell him that they did not mean what they appeared to his eyes. He knew better. Then there were the plain, simple words standing like a solid wall of granite. As one whom his mother comforteth, so will I comfort you. Stand around, said Bud in a tone of authority, and while the gray pony obeyed, he told her his resolve. Them words mean something, Dolly, and she knows what they mean, and Bud is going to find out. You are not to suppose that the pronoun referred to Alice Ansted. She had said that she could not tell him what they meant. If anybody had been looking on with wide open eyes, it would have been an interesting study in Providence to watch how Bud was led. It was Alice Ansted who had a very little hand in it again, though she knew nothing of it. The leading was connected, too, with so insignificant a matter as an umbrella. Mr. Ramsay had overtaken Louis Ansted in a rainstorm a few days before, and had insisted on lending his umbrella, and it suited Louis Ansted's convenience to direct that it be sent home by Bud that morning. Why Alice Ansted took the trouble to go herself to Bud with that order, instead of sending a servant, she hardly knew, neither did she understand why, after having given it, she should have lingered to say, "I presume, Bud, that Mr. Ramsay can answer all the questions about Jerusalem that you choose to ask." Now, Mr. Ramsay was the dreary minister who seemed to Claire Benedict to have no life nor heart in any of his work. Bud stood still to reflect over this new thought suggested to him with a half laugh. He did not think to thank Miss Alice, and yet he knew that he was glad. It was true, the minister would be likely to know all about it, and there might not be a chance to speak with Miss Benedict again, and Bud felt that he could not wait. So, as he trudged off down the carriage drive, he took his resolution. He had never spoken a word to a minister in his life, but he would ask to see him this morning, and find out about Jerusalem if he could. End of chapter 18. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 19 of Interrupted by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. Comforted. Saturday morning, and the minister in his dingy study struggling with an unfinished sermon. Struggling with more than this, with an attempt to keep in the background certain sad and startling facts that his meat bill was growing larger, and that his last quarter's salary was still unpaid, that his wife was at this moment doing some of the family washing which illness had prevented her from accomplishing before, and taking care of 2 children at the same time, that his Sunday coat was growing hopelessly shabby, and there was nothing in his pocketbook wherewith to replace it with a new one, that the children needed shoes, and there was no money to buy them, that the wife was wearing herself out with overwork and anxiety, and he was powerless to help it, that his people were absorbed in their farms and stores and shops, and cared little for him or for the truths which he tried to present. What a spirit in which to prepare a sermon for the Sabbath that was hurrying on! The study was dingy from force of necessity. The carpet was faded and worn in places into positive holes. The table spread was faded because it had been long worn, and was cheap goods and cheap colors in the first place. Everything about him was wearing out, and the old young minister felt that he was wearing out too, years before his time. I do not know that it is any wonder that he frowned when he heard the knock at the side door. It was nearly Saturday noon. He had not time for loiterers, yet he must answer that knock. Thus much he could save his wife. He threw down his pen, with which he had just written the half-formed sentence, "The inexorable and inscrutable decrees of God," and went to the door to admit Bud and the umbrella. Not much need for delay here, and yet Bud lingered. The umbrella had been set aside, and the minister had said that it was no matter that it had not been brought before, and still Bud did not go. He held his hat in his hand, and worked with nervous fingers at the frayed band around it, and at last, summoning all his courage, dashed into the center of his subject. "If you please, sir, will you tell me where Jerusalem is?" "Jerusalem!" replied the minister, and he was even more astonished than Alice Ansted had been. But he looked into Bud's eager, wistful face, and saw there something, he did not understand what, which made him throw the door open wider and say, "Come in," and almost before he knew what he was doing, he had seated Bud in the old armchair by the stove, in the study, and was sitting opposite him. You don't expect me, I hope, to describe that interview. There have been many like it in degree all over the world, but nothing quite so strange had ever come to this minister before. Actually a hungry soul looking for the Jerusalem above, about which he, the minister, had read that morning, with bated breath and an almost rebellious longing to be there, where "there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away." It was not difficult to show Bud the way. He was like a child who heard with wide open wondering eyes, and for the first time, the astounding fact that the Jerusalem toward which his eyes were turned was near at hand, that there was no ocean to cross, no dangerous journey to take. It was simply to put forth the hand and accept the free gift. I pause, pen in hand, to wonder how I can make plain to you that this is no made-up story, that Bud is a real character who lives and does his work in the world today. It is so natural in reading what people call fiction to turn from the book with a little sigh perhaps and say, "Oh, yes, that is all very well in a book, but in real life things do not happen in this way, and there are no people so ignorant as that Bud, anyway." But some of us do not write fiction. We merely aim to present in compact form before thoughtful people pictures of the things which are taking place all around them. Bud did live and does live, and he was just so ignorant, and he did hear with joy the simple, wonderful story of the way to the Jerusalem of his desires, and he did plant his feet firmly on the narrow road and walk therein. I want to tell you what that minister did after the door had been closed on Bud for a few minutes. He walked the floor of his limited study with quick, excited steps, 3 times up and down, then he dropped on his knees and prayed this one sentence: "Blessed be the Lord God, who only doeth wondrous things." Then he went out to the kitchen and kissed his wife, and made up the fire under her wash-boiler, and filled 2 pails with water, and carried Johnny away and established him in a high chair in the study, with pencil and paper and a picture book. And then he took the 5 sheets of that sermon over which he had been struggling, and tore them in 2, and thrust them, decrees and all, into the stove. Not that he was done with the decrees, or that he thought less of them than before. But a miracle had just been worked in his study, and he had been permitted to be the connecting link in this wondrous chain through which ran the message to a new-born soul, and the decree which held him captive just then was that one in which the eternal God planned to give his Son to save the world. And he was so glad that this decree was inexorable, that its inscrutability did not trouble him at all. I am glad that he made up that fire and filled those water pails, and, busy as he had need to be, gave some gentle attention to Johnny. A religious uplifting which does not bubble over into whatever practical work the heart or the hands find to do, is not apt to continue. It was on the following Sabbath that Miss Benedict found opportunity to offer to mark the verses in Bud's Bible. "Bud," she said, stopping at the bell rope where he tolled the bell, "if you will let me take your Bible after church, did you bring it with you? Well, if you will let me take it, I will mark some verses in it that I think will help you. Did you read a verse each day?" "Oh, yes'm," said Bud, and there was that in his voice which made her turn and look closely at him. "I read it, and I found out the way, and I went and spoke to him, and he took me right in, as he said he would, and there's no comfort like it, I'm sure. I don't miss little Jack's mother any more." What did all this mean? Bud began in the middle of things, according to his wont. He forgot that Miss Benedict had heard nothing about the promised comfort in Jerusalem, nor the difficulties he had had in being shown into the right way. Yet there is something in the family language, however awkwardly used, that conveys a meaning to those of the same household. "Bud, do you really mean that you went to Jesus Christ, and he gave you comfort?" "I do that, ma'am," said Bud, with a hearty voice and shining eyes, and he gave the bell rope a vigorous pull. He was right by my side all the time, the minister said, when I bothered so about crossing the ocean, and there wasn't any ocean to cross. And I've got the comfort, and I'm going to hear the singing that you told about. I didn't think I ever could, but now I know the way." Claire turned away silently and walked softly into church, awed. Had poor Bud really met the Lord in the way? It looked so. She need have no more regrets over those unmarked verses. But how wonderful it was! And that is just the truth, dear half-asleep Christian. Wonders are taking place all about you, and it is possible that you are merely engaged in trying to prove to yourself and others that the age of miracles is past, though why you should be very anxious to prove it does not clearly appear even to yourself. The minister who preached that morning was the same minister who had stood behind that desk and read his sermons to that people for 7 years, though some of his hearers rubbed their eyes and looked about them in a dazed way, and wondered if this could be so. What had happened to the man? He had not a scrap of paper before him. In the estimation of some, he did not preach. Mrs. Graves, who read sermons aloud at home on Sabbath afternoons, and was inclined to be literary, said that it was not a sermon at all, that it was just a talk. But Deacon Graves, who was not literary, replied, "Well, if he should take to talking very often, we should all have to wake up and look after our living, for it pretty nigh upset everything we have done this good while, and I must say it kind of made me feel as though I should like to see something stirring somewhere." None of them knew about the minister's uplifting, only Bud, and Bud did not know that it was an uplifting, or that the minister cared, or that the sermon had anything to do with him, or, for that matter, that it was any different than usual. Bud knew he was different, and it gave him the most intense and exquisite joy to discover that he understood nearly every word that the minister said. But this he attributed not to a change in the sermon, but because he had fairly started on his journey to the heavenly Jerusalem. It is possible that some listeners need that sort of uplifting before the sermons to which they appear to listen will ever be other than idle words. Yes, there was one other who knew that a strange and sweet experience had come to the disheartened minister. That was his wife. She had known it ever since he came and kissed her, and made up that fire, and filled those pails. The kiss would have been very precious to her without the other, but the human heart is such a strange bit of mechanism that I shall have to confess to you that in the light of that new-made fire the tenderness glowed all day. And now the preparations for the concert went on with rapid strides. The Ansteds slipped into the program almost before they realized it, and were committed to this and that chorus and solo, and planned and rearranged and advised with an energy that surprised themselves. It has been intimated to you that opportunities for enjoying good music were rare at South Plains. What musical talent they possessed had lain dormant, and the place was too small to attract concert singers, so an invitation to a musical entertainment came to the people with all the charm of novelty. Of course, the girls took care that the invitations should be numerous and cordial. In fact, for 3 weeks before the eventful evening, almost the sole topic of conversation, even in the corner grocery, had been the young folks' concert and the preparations that were making. Still, after taking all these things into consideration, both the girls and their leader were amazed, when at last the hour arrived, to discover that every available inch of room in the stuffy little church was taken. "For once in its life it is full," announced Anna Graves, peeping out, and then dodging hastily back. "Girls, it is full to actual suffocation, I should think, and they have come to hear us sing. Think of it!" Well, whether those girls astonished themselves or not, they certainly did their fathers and mothers. Indeed, I am not sure that their young teacher did not feel an emotion of surprise over the fact that they acquitted themselves so well. Their voices, when not strained in attempting music too difficult for them, had been found capable of much more cultivation than she had at first supposed, and she had done her best for them without realizing until now how much that best was accomplishing. It was really such a success, and withal such a surprise, that some of the time it was hard to keep back the happy tears. It is true, there was one element in the entertainment which the teacher did not give its proper amount of credit. The fact is, she had so long been accustomed to her own voice as to have forgotten that to strangers it was wonderful. I suppose that really part of the charm of her singing lay in the simplicity of the singer. Her life had been spent in a city, where she came in daily contact with grand and highly cultivated voices, and she, therefore, gauged her own as simply one among many, and a bird could hardly have appeared less conscious of his powers than did she. Not so her audience. They thundered their delight until again and again she was obliged to appear, and each time she sang a simple little song or hymn suited to the musical capacities of the audience, so that she but increased their desire for more. It was all delightful. Yet really, sordid beings that they were, I shall have to admit that the crowning delight was when they met the next morning, tired but happy, and counted over their gains, and looked at each other's faces, and exclaimed, and laughed, and actually cried a little over the pecuniary result. "Girls," said Miss Benedict, her eyes glowing with delight, "we can carpet the entire aisles! Think of that!" Then began work. "Since we haven't been doing anything for the last 2 months," said Mary Burton, with a merry laugh, "I suppose we can have the privilege of going to work now." Meantime, the days had been moving steadily on. Christmas holidays had come and gone, and the boys, as well as the girls, to whom the holiday season had been apt to be a time of special dissipation and temptation, had been tided safely over it by reason of being so busy that they had no time for their usual festivities. The vacation to which Claire Benedict had looked forward with sad heart on her first coming to South Plains, because it would be a time when she might honorably go home if she could afford it, and she knew she could not, had come and passed, and had found her in such a whirl of work, so absorbed from morning until night as to have time only for postals for the mother and sister. "When the rush of work is over," so she wrote, "I will stop for repairs, and take time to write some respectably lengthy letters. But just now we are so overwhelmed with our desire to get the church ready for Easter Sunday that we can think of nothing else. Mamma, I do wish you and Dora could see it now, and again after it emerges from under our hands." "What is the matter with her?" asked Dora, and then mother and daughter laughed. It was impossible to be very dreary with those breezy postals constantly coming from Claire. It was impossible not to have an almost absorbing interest in the church at South Plains, and to think of and plan for it accordingly. "Mamma," Dora said, after having read the latest postal, as she sat bending it into various graceful shapes, "I suppose that church down on the beach that the girls of our society are working for looks something like the one at South Plains. I think I will join that society after all. I suppose I ought to be doing something, since Claire has taken up the repairing of old churches for a life business." This last with a little laugh, and the mother wrote to Claire a few days later: "Your sister has finally succeeded in overcoming her dislike to joining the Benevolent Society again, and is becoming interested in their work. They have taken up that seaside church again, which you were going to do such nice things for, you know. Dora has felt all the time that there was nothing for her to do now, because we are poor, and has held aloof, but yesterday she joined the girls, and brought home aprons to make for the ready-made department of Mr. Stevenson's store. The plan is that Mr. Stevenson shall furnish shades for the church windows at cost, and the girls are to pay him by making up aprons for that department. I am glad for anything that rouses Dora. Not that she is bitter, but she is sad, and feels herself useless. My dear, you are doing more than repairing the church at South Plains. You are reaching, you see, away out into the seaside. End of chapter 19. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 20 of Interrupted by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. Bud as a Teacher. It became a matter of astonishment to discover how many friends the old church had, and from what unexpected quarters they appeared. It really seemed as though each worker had an uncle or brother or cousin, of whom she had not given a thought in this connection, who yet grew interested and offered help. It was Anna Graves who started this special form of help by an announcement that she made one morning. "Girls, what do you think? My Uncle Will is coming to stay 2 weeks, and he says he will fresco the church ceiling for us, if we will be content with plain work that he can do rapidly." It did not take the eager listeners long to promise to be content with the very plainest work that could be imagined. Their imagination had not thought of reaching after frescoed ceilings. "That is an idea," said Nettie Burdick. "I wonder if Joe and Charlie would not help us?" Now Joe and Charlie were wallpaperers in the city, and it was only a few days thereafter that Nettie announced with great satisfaction that they would come out and paper the old church for their share in the good work. Then came Ruth Jennings's brother-in-law, who was in business in a more distant city, and having called for Ruth and waited for her on the evening when that perplexing question of window shades was being discussed, he volunteered a delightful bit of information. Didn't they know about the new paper in imitation of stained glass? So good an imitation that when well laid it would take an expert to distinguish the difference. No, indeed, they had never heard of such a thing, and all other business was suspended while the brother-in-law was plied with questions, the conclusion of the matter being that he said their firm dealt quite largely in this new invention, and he could have enough for this little church supplied at cost, if they would like to go into it. And being able to give, in round numbers, the probable cost, the girls gleefully voted to go into it, provided they could secure any person who knew how to manage it. This at once developed further resources belonging to the brother-in-law. He knew all about it, and would lay the paper for them with pleasure, if some of the fellows would help. He would just as soon spend a day in that way as not. "Stained glass windows!" said Ruth Jennings, with a long-drawn sigh of satisfaction. "As if South Plains had ever dreamed of attaining to such heights! Girls, will the old red curtains do for dusters, do you believe, if we wash them tremendously?" The very next day brought them another surprise. Miss Benedict read part of a letter from Mama, wherein it appeared that a certain Mr. Stewart, of the firm of Stewart, Greenup and Company, had become interested in the church at South Plains through Dora's reports of what absorbed her sister's energies, and in grateful remembrance of certain helps which Claire's father had given their church in its struggling infancy, he had selected a walnut desk and 2 pulpit chairs, which he had taken the liberty to ship to Miss Claire Benedict, with his kind regards and earnest wish that her efforts might be prospered, even as her father's had been before her. Over this astonishing piece of news some of the girls actually cried. The pulpit desk and chairs had represented a formidable bill of expense looming up before them. Each had been privately sure that they would be obliged at last to take those which would jar on their aesthetic tastes, out of respect to the leanness of the church purse. And here was solid walnut, selected by a man of undoubted taste and extensive knowledge in this direction. I don't think it strange that they cried. Mary Burton, while she wiped her eyes, made a remark which was startling to some of the girls. "How much your father has done for us this winter!" And she looked directly at Claire Benedict. Didn't Mary remember that the dear father was dead? But Miss Benedict understood. Her eyes, which had remained bright with excitement until then, suddenly dimmed, but her smile and her voice were very sweet. "Oh, Mary, thank you," was all she said. Among the workers it would have been hard to find one more faithful or more energetic than Bud. He was full of eager, happy life. Much depended upon him. He could blacken stoves with the skill of a professional, and none were ever more vigorously rubbed than those rusty, ash-bestrewn ones which had so long disgraced the church. It had been good for Bud to have others awaken to the fact that there were certain things which he could do, and do well. An eventful winter was this to him. Having made an actual start toward Jerusalem, it was found that he put more energy into the journey than many who had been long on the way, and, as a matter of course, before long it became apparent that he was taking rapid strides. Miss Alice Ansted was among the first to realize it. She came to Claire one evening with embarrassed laughter and a half-serious, half-amused request for instruction. "I'm trying to follow out some of your hints, and they are getting me into more trouble than anything I ever undertook. Sewing societies and charity parties are as nothing in comparison. I am trying to teach Bud. He wants to study arithmetic. It is an absurd idea, I think. What will he ever want of arithmetic? But he was determined, and you were determined, and between you I have been foolish enough to undertake it. And now it appears that arithmetic is a very small portion of what he wants to learn. He wants to know everything that there is in the Bible, and where church members get their ideas about all sorts of things, and what the ministers study in the theological seminary, and why all the people in the world don't attend prayer meeting, and I don't know what not. He acts as though his brain had been under a paralysis all his life, which had just been removed. I must say he astonishes me with his questions, but it is easier to ask questions than it is to answer them. What, for instance, am I to say to ideas like these? Since you have gotten me into this scrape, it is no more than fair that you should help me to see daylight." And then would follow a discussion, nearly always pertaining to some of the practical truths of the Christian life, or to some direction that Bud had found in the course of his daily Bible verse, which seemed to him at variance with the life which was being lived by the professing Christians about him, and which he turned to his arithmetic teacher to reconcile. Bud, being ignorant, found it impossible to understand why people who professed to take the Bible for their rule of life did not follow its teachings, and he brought each fresh problem to Alice Ansted with such confident expectation that she knew all about it, that she, who had only volunteered to explain to him the rules of arithmetic, was in daily embarrassment. From these conversations, which constantly grew more close and searching as Bud stumbled on new verses, Claire Benedict used to turn with a smile of satisfaction, as well as with almost a feeling of awe, over the wisdom of the great teacher. Alice Ansted might be teaching Bud the principles of arithmetic, but he was certainly daily teaching her the principles of the religion which she professed but did not live. In fact, others besides Alice Ansted were being taught, or at least were being roused, by the newly awakened mind. The minister had by no means forgotten the visit which had glorified the study for that day, and he was still bathing his almost discouraged heart in the brightness of its memory, when a vigorous knock one morning again interrupted his studies. His eyes brightened when he saw that the visitor was Bud, and he invited him in with cordial tone. But no, Bud was in haste. There was not a trace of the hesitancy and embarrassment which had characterized his first visit. He spoke with the confidence of one who had obtained great and sufficient help at this source before, and who knew that it was the place where help could be found. "I haven't any time this morning," he said, speaking with a rapidity which had begun to characterize his newly awakened life. "I'm down at Snyder's waiting for the pony to be shod, and there is a fellow there talking. He says the Bible ain't true, that it is just a lot of made-up stories to cheat women and children and folks that don't know nothing, like me. Well now, I know that it is no such a thing. I know the Bible is true because I've tried it. But he hasn't tried it, you see, sir, and he won't because he don't believe in it, and I thought I would just run up here and ask you to give me something to show him that it is all true, something that I can tell him in a hurry, because the pony will be ready in a few minutes." What in the world was that minister to say? Was there ever such an embarrassing question thrust at him? The evidences of Christianity, yes, he had studied them carefully, of course he had. He had written sermons to prove the truth of the Holy Scriptures. He had a row of books on the upper shelf of his library, all of them treating more or less of this subject. He turned and looked at them. Ponderous volumes, it was not possible to take down even the smallest of them and set Bud to reading it. In the first place, Bud would no more understand the language in which it was written than he would understand the Greek Testament which stood by its side, and, in the second place, Bud wanted knowledge that could be transmitted while the pony was being shod. Certainly, this dilemma had its ludicrous side, but had it not also its humiliating one? Ought there not to be some word which an educated man like himself could give in haste to an ignorant boy like Bud? Something so plain that even the pony need not wait while it was being explained. Suppose the man at the blacksmith shop had chosen to sneer over the fact that the earth is round, and Bud had come for an argument to prove the truth of this fact, how easy it would be to produce one. Ought he not to be equally ready to defend this much slandered Bible? Thoughts are very rapid in their transit. Something like these ideas rushed through the scholar's mind while he stood looking up at his row of books, and Bud stood looking up at him with an air of confident expectation. "Bud," said the minister, turning suddenly away from his bookshelves, "how many persons are there at Snyder's?" "8 or 9, sir, maybe more." "Are they from around here?" "No, sir, mostly from the country. I don't know any of 'em." "Well, Bud, I want you to listen carefully while I ask 2 or 3 questions. Suppose you had been there before any of those men, and as one after another began to come in, each should tell of a fire there had been last night in the city. Suppose you knew that they were not acquainted with each other, and had not met until they reached the blacksmith's shop, and suppose they told the same story without contradicting one another in any of the important particulars, what do you believe you would conclude about them? Would you think that they had told the truth or a made-up story?" "I reckon it would be the truth, sir, 'cause how would they know how to make it up alike?" "That is just the point," said the gratified minister. While he talked he had been watching Bud carefully, much in doubt as to whether he had mind enough to grasp the illustration, but so far it had evidently been grasped. Now he must see if it could be applied. "Listen. Do you know that 36 people told the story of the Bible, and that many of them not only never saw one another, but many of them died before others of them were born, and that they told the same story without contradicting one another at all?" "No, sir," said Bud. "I didn't know nothing about it. Is that so?" Extreme delight glowed in his honest eyes, and he clutched at his cap and made a movement toward the door. "I thank you, sir. I'll go back and tell them. It will be a stunner." Away went the newly awakened preacher of the evidences of Christianity, and the minister went back to his Greek Testament with great satisfaction. Bud might not be able to convince the scoffer at the blacksmith shop. Mr. Ramsey did not expect that he would. He knew that Satan had many skillful ways of using false weapons and making them flash like true steel. The thing which gave him pleasure was, that Bud had understood. He felt nearly certain that the boy's mind would not leave the question there. It would have to be investigated, and he, the minister, would have to get ready to help him. "We ought to be careful to speak about all these things in such a way that uneducated people could follow us," he said. And all that morning, while he worked over his sermon for the following Sabbath, he worked to secure simple words in which to clothe his thought. He sought illustrations to give it clearness. In short, he preached to Bud. Almost unconsciously, he brought the boy before his mind's eye, cap in hand, a symbol of the people whose thoughts rested for a moment on what you were saying, and then flitted away to something else, unless, indeed, the owners were caught during that moment. This particular minister had never before so fully realized this truth. He had never before labored so hard to catch the attention of the unskilled listener, nor had he ever become so intensely interested in any sermon as he did in that one. If he was to preach it for Bud, it must be very simple, and in making it very simple, his own heart took hold of it as a tremendous reality, instead of a thought out of a book. I hope I shall be understood when I say that Bud wrote the greater part of the minister's sermon that week, though he, of course, was utterly unconscious of the fact. End of chapter 20. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 21 of Interrupted by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. One of the Victims. Meantime, there were other interests at stake that winter than those involved in the renovation of the old church. For instance, there was Harry Matthews, who kept Claire's heart constantly filled with anxious thought. It became more and more apparent that he was in great and growing danger. Claire saw much of him. He had been one of the most faithful helpers during the preparations for the concert, and he was still one of the energetic workers, being included in all their plans. Moreover, he was a genial, society-loving, warm-hearted young fellow, one of the sort with whom a sympathetic girl soon becomes intimate. Claire had often, in the earlier days of her girlhood, sighed over the fact that she had no brother, and now it seemed sometimes to her as if this Harry were a sort of brother, over whose interests she must watch. So she exercised an older sister's privilege in growing very anxious about him. Neither was he so gaily happy as he had been early in the season. He had kept his pledge, coming to her at first with laughing eyes and mock gravity of face, pretending to make confession like the good little boy in the story-book who is sorry and won't do so any more if he can help it. She always received these admissions with a gentle gravity, so unmistakably tinged with sadness and disappointment that they presently ceased to be amusing to him. He was beginning to make discoveries. First, that it was by no means an agreeable thing for a manly young man to seek a young woman whom he respected, and voluntarily admit that he had again been guilty of what he knew she looked upon with distrust, not only, but with actual dismay. And second, that he had the confession to make much more frequently than he had supposed could possibly be the case. In short, the habit which he had supposed such a light one was growing upon him, that on occasions when he withstood the invitations and temptations, the struggle was a hard one, which he shrank from renewing. Still he made resolves. It was absurd to suppose that he could keep running after Miss Benedict, or sending her notes to say that he had again indulged in a habit that he had assured her was of no consequence, and that he could break in a day if he chose. He knew now that this was folly. It was not to be broken in a day. He began to suspect that possibly he was a slave, with little or no power to break it at all. The tenor of his notes changed steadily. The first one ran thus: I have to inform your most gracious Majesty that I have this day committed the indiscretion of taking about 2/3 of a glass of champagne with an old school chum whom I have not seen for 6 months. It is another chapter of the old story. He beguiled me, and I did drink. Of course, it was no fault of mine, and it gives me comfort to inform you that the tempter has gone on his way to Chicago, and that I do not expect to see him for another 6 months. So humbly craving your Majesty's pardon for being thus obliged to trouble her, owing to a certain foolish pledge of mine, I remain your humble subject, Harry Matthews. The last one she received was briefly this: Miss Benedict, I have failed again, though I did not mean to do so. I beg you will erase my name from that page, and care nothing more about it or me. Over the first note Claire had lingered with a troubled air, but on this last one there dropped tears. She had adopted Harry by this time as a young brother, and she could not help carrying his peril about in her heart. Still, if he had not gone too far, there was more hope for the writer of this brief note, with its undertone of fierce self-disgust, than for the one who could so merrily confess what he believed was, at the worst, a foible. One evening they walked home together from the church. She was silent, and her heart was heavy. She had caught the odor of wine about him, though he had made a weak effort to conceal it with rich spices. They walked half the distance from the church to the academy, having spoken nothing beyond an occasional commonplace. Truth to tell, Claire was in doubt what to say, or whether to say anything. She had spoken many words to him. She had written him earnest little notes. What use to say more? It was he who broke the silence, speaking moodily. "It is of no use, Miss Benedict. I shall have to ask you to release me from that pledge. I cannot keep rushing around to the academy to tell you what befalls me. It is absurd. And, well, the fact is, as I am situated, I simply cannot keep from using liquor now and then. Oftener, indeed, than I had supposed when I signed that paper. It must have been a great bore to you, and I owe you 1,000 apologies. But you see how it is, I must be released and left to myself. I have been true to my promise, as I knew I should be when I made it, but I can't have you troubled any longer, and as I say, I have to drink occasionally." He did not receive the sort of answer which he had expected. He was prepared for an earnest protest, for an argument. But Claire said, her voice very sad the while, "I know you cannot keep from drinking, Harry, and I have known it for a long while." Now, although he had told himself several times in a disgusted way that he was a coward and a fool and a slave, and that he did not deserve to have the respect of a lady, his pride was by no means so far gone that he liked to hear the admission from other lips than his own that he was bound in chains which he could not break. "What do you mean?" he asked haughtily enough. "I mean, Harry, that you are tempted, awfully tempted, to become a drunkard. I mean that I do not think you can help yourself. I think you have gone beyond the line where your strength would be sufficient. You inherit the taste for liquor, never mind how I learned that. I know it, and I have known it for a long time. As surely as Satan lives, he has you in his toils. Oh, Harry!" There were tears in her voice. She was not one who easily lost self-control before others, but this was a subject on which her heart was sore. He did not know how many times she had said to herself, "What if he were my brother, and mamma sat at home watching and praying for him, and he were as he is? And his mother is a widow, and has only this one, and she sits at home and waits." And this mother's fast coming agony of discovery had burned into her soul until it is no wonder that the tears choked what else she might have said. But Harry was haughty still. He was more than that, however. He was frightened. If the darkness of the night had not shielded his face from observation, its pallor would have frightened her. He tried, however, to steady his voice as he said, "Miss Benedict, what do you mean? I do not understand. Do you mean that I am foreordained to become a drunkard, and that I cannot help myself?" "Oh, Harry, I mean that the great enemy of your soul has discovered just how he can ruin you, body and soul, and he means to do it. You have toyed with him until you cannot help yourself. You cannot, Harry. There is no use to fancy that you can. He has ruined many a young man as self-reliant as you. He is too strong for you, and too mean. He has ways of dissembling that you would scorn. He is not honest with you. He has made you believe what was utterly false. He has you in his toils, and as surely as you are here tonight, just so surely will you fail in the battle with him. You do not know how to cope with Satan. You need not flatter yourself that you do. He has played with many a soul, coaxed it to feel just that sense of superiority over him which you feel, until it was too late, and then laughed at his victim for being a dupe." During the first part of this sentence, Harry Matthews, though startled, was also angry. He had always prided himself on his self-control, upon being able to go just so far in a given direction and no farther, unless he chose. And even in this matter, when he had accused himself of being a slave, he had not believed it. He had believed simply that he had discovered himself to be more fond of intoxicants than he had supposed, and that the effect to give them up involved more self-sacrifice than it was worth while to make. And while he was vexed that even this was so, he had honestly believed this to be the whole story. It was not until this moment that the sense of being in actual peril, and being insufficient for his own rescue, rushed over him. I do not know why it did at that time, unless the Holy Spirit saw his opportunity and willed that it should be so. There was almost mortal anguish in the low voice that sounded at last in answer to Claire's cry of fear. "God help me, then! What can I do?" The question surprised Claire, startled her. She had prayed for it, but she was like many another Christian worker in that she had not seemed to expect the answer to her prayer. Verily, he has to be content with exceeding little faith. Claire had expected the blind young man would go on excusing himself, and assuring her of her mistake. None the less, she was eager with her answer. "If you only meant that cry! If you only would give up the unequal strife, and stand aside and cry out, 'O Lord, undertake for me!' what a world would be revealed to you! Harry Matthews, there is just one who fought a battle with Satan and came off victor, and there never will be another. The victory must come through him, or it is at best a very partial, and at all times a doubtful one. In him are safety and everlasting strength, and outside of him is danger." She did not say another word, nor did he, other than a half-audible good night as he held open the academy gate for her to pass. She went in feeling frightened over much that she had said. Ought she to have spoken so hopelessly to him? What if he turned in despair and plunged into excesses such as he had not known before? Men had reformed and signed the pledge and kept it, apparently without the aid of Christ. At least, they had not owned allegiance to him, though well she knew that his restraining grace was, after all, what kept any man from rushing headlong into ruin. God held back even those who would not own his detaining arm. But she had felt so hopeless in regard to Harry, so certain that nothing short of an acknowledged leaning on Christ would be sufficient for his needs. The more she had prayed for him, the more sure she had been that in Christ alone lay his refuge. She had not meant to say this to him, yet the thoughts seemed to crowd out of themselves when he gave them opportunity. Now she went to her room shivering and trembling over the possible results. She had very little opportunity, however, for thought. There was that awaiting her which was not calculated to quiet her mind. It was Alice Ansted who rose up from before the east window, where a fine view was to be had of the rising moon, and came forward to meet her as she entered her own room. "I beg your pardon for having taken possession. There was company in the parlor, and Mrs. Foster said she thought I might come here and wait for you. Is there another committee meeting this evening, or can I hope to have you to myself for 5 minutes?" "There is no committee meeting this evening," Claire said, smiling. "We have been down to measure the platform and arrange for the organ, but I believe now that everything is done. Take this easy chair. I am glad you waited for me. There are several things about which I wish to consult you," she added. "They have to do with that church, I know. I shall not let you get started on that topic. I should be perfectly certain not to get you back to any other tonight, and I want to do the talking myself. I cannot see why you care so much for that church." Claire laughed. "We care for anything for which we work, and especially for which we sacrifice a little, you know. Why, you care for it yourself. Don't you think you do, a little?" "I care for you and for your opinion. I have been telling mamma only this evening that when the old barn gets fixed up, I believe I will go down there to church. I am not so fond of riding that I care to take an 8-mile ride every Sunday. Besides, I think it looks silly. Mamma thinks we are all becoming idiotic, for all the daughters and the son sided with me, and papa said he didn't care a rushlight which we did. That it would be easier for the horses to come down here." "Good news," said Claire brightly. "I have been hoping for something of the kind. Then you will begin to attend the prayer meeting, of course, and it does need you so much." "I'm sure I don't see why I should. I never attended prayer meeting in town, and I have belonged to that church for years. The idea of my helping along a prayer meeting! You do have some very absurd ideas, Claire Benedict, though I may as well admit that the only reason I would have for coming here to church would be to give you pleasure. But this is not in the least what I came to talk to you about. I knew we should get on that subject, and never get away from it." "Let us go right away from it, and tell me, please, just what you want to talk about. Only let me say this one little thing. I want you to come down to prayer meeting next Wednesday evening, and discover in how many ways you can help it. Now I am ready." End of chapter 21. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 22 of Interrupted by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. New Lines of Work. But Alice hesitated. The subject, whatever it was that she wanted to talk about, evidently had its embarrassing side. Now that Claire sat in expectant silence, she grew silent too, and looked down, and toyed with the fringe of her wrap, her face in a frown that indicated either perplexity or distrust. "I don't know why I should come to you," she said at last, speaking half angrily. "I suppose I am a simpleton, and shall get little thanks for any interference, yet it certainly seems to me as though something ought to be done, and as though you might do it." "If there is any way in which I can help you," Claire said, "you hardly need to have me say how glad I shall be to do so." "Would you, I wonder? Would you help in a perplexity that seems to me to be growing into a downright danger, and which I more than half suspect you could avert?" There was something so significant in her tone that Claire looked at her in wonderment for a moment, then said, choosing her words with care, "You surely know that I would be only too glad to help you in any way that was right, and of course you would not ask me to do anything that I thought wrong." "Oh, I'm not so sure of that. You have such peculiar ideas of right and wrong. They are not according to my standard, I presume. How I wish I knew, without telling you, just what you would think right. It would settle several questions for me, or else it would unsettle me, for I might not want to do what was right, you see, any more than you would want to do what was wrong." "I am not a witch," said Claire lightly, "and I confess that I have no more idea what you mean than if you were speaking in Sanskrit. Perhaps you speak English for a few minutes, my friend, and enlighten me." "I will, presently. I want to ask you a few general questions first, which have nothing special to do with the question at hand. Would you marry a man who was not a Christian?" "No," said Claire, wondering, startled yet nevertheless prompt enough with her answer. "That is, I do not now see how I could. In the first place, I would not be likely to have the opportunity, for I could not be sufficiently interested in a man who had no sympathy with me in these vital questions to ever reach the point as to my possible opportunities and duties." "Oh, well, that doesn't materially enlighten me. You see, I am talking about people who could become sufficiently interested to reach a great many questionings, and not know what to do with them. Let me suppose a case. We will say the people live in China, and become deeply interested in each other. In the course of time, one of them goes to the Fiji Islands, for instance, and meets a missionary, and comes somewhat under her influence. Enough, we will say, to make her uncomfortable, and to make her suspect that she is a good deal of a heathen herself, though she was a member in good and regular standing of a church in China. To make the circumstances more interesting, you may suppose that one of the converted heathen begins to interest himself in her, and to enlighten her as to the power of genuine religion over the heathen heart and mind to such an extent that she is almost sure she knows nothing about it experimentally, and at the same time has a yearning desire to know and to receive the mysterious something which she discovers in this one. We will also suppose that she receives letters from China occasionally, which show her that the other party has met neither missionary nor heathen to impress him in any way, and that his plans and determinations are all of the earth and decidedly earthy, and yet he is disposed to think that the lady might be thinking about returning to China and joining him in his effort to have a good time. What, in your estimation, ought the half-awakened Fiji resident to do? Alice, is not some very distant city representing China? And is South Plains Fiji? And is Bud the converted heathen? There is enough witch about you to have secured you a very warm experience in the olden days. Never mind translating, if you please. This is not to be in English. What ought the Fiji to do? I should think there could be no question. A half-awakened person would still be in danger of dropping back into darkness, and should, as surely as she believes in the petition, lead me not into temptation, guard against anything that would be a contradiction to that prayer. Well, but suppose this half-awakened person were married to the party in China, what then? That would be a very different matter. The irrevocable vows would have been taken before the world. The "until death do you part" would have been accepted, and there would be no liberty of choice. I don't see the reasoning clearly. Suppose a person should take a vow to commit murder, and announce her determination before the world to do so, with as solemn a vow as you please, ought her conscience to hold her? Not, she added with a slight and embarrassed laugh, that I would put the idea of murder as a parallel case with the other imagining. I don't mean anything, you know, by all this. I am simply dealing with some imaginary people in China. But Claire did not smile, and held herself carefully to the analogy of the illustration. You are supposing a moral impossibility, Alice. No one would be allowed to take a public and solemn oath to commit murder. The very oath would be a violation of the laws of God and of the land. But in the other case, the oath taken professes to be in keeping with God's revealed will and with the demands of respectable society. Surely you see what an infinite difference this would make. Ah, yes, of course. Well, I'll suppose one thing more. For purposes of convenience, let us have these two people engaged to each other, but the pledge not consummated before the public. What then? But over this question Claire kept a troubled silence. I do not know, she said at last. I am not sure how that ought to be answered. Perhaps it is one of the things which each individual is called upon to answer for himself or herself, taking it to God for special light. A betrothal seems to me a very solemn thing, not to be either entered into or broken lightly, and yet I can conceive of circumstances wherein it would be right to break the pledge, where it was wrong ever to have made it, and two wrongs cannot make a right, you know. But, Alice, this is dangerous ground. I am almost inclined to think it is ground where a third party, on the human side, should not intermeddle. At least, unless it is one who has far more wisdom than I. It is not possible for me to advise you in this. You have advised me, Alice said with exceeding gravity. All I wanted was your individual opinion, and that you have given plainly, though you may not be aware of it. When one knows one is doing a thing that is wrong, I suppose the time has come to draw back." "If the drawing back can right the wrong." "It can help toward it. These people, who live in China, remember, are perhaps among those who ought never to have made the pledge. However, let us drop them. I want to talk to you about a more important matter." Still she did not talk, but relapsed again into troubled silence, and Claire, not knowing what to say, waited and said nothing. "Would you marry a man if you thought you might possibly be the means of saving his soul?" Claire was startled and a trifle disturbed to think that the conversation was still to run in a channel with which she was so unfamiliar. Still, this first question was comparatively easy to deal with. "That might depend on whether I could do so without assuming false vows. I could not promise a lie for the sake of saving any soul. Besides, it being wrong in itself, I would have no reason to hope that it would be productive of any good, for God does not save souls by means which are sinful. Why do you ask me all these questions, Alice? I have no experience and am not wise. I wish you would seek a better counselor." "Never mind, I have all the counsel I desire. I am not talking about those people in China any more, though you think I am. I was thinking of you, and of somebody who is in danger, and whom I believe you could save, but I know you won't, at least not in that way. Claire Benedict, I am troubled about my brother. Tell me this, do you know that he is in danger?" "Yes," said Claire, her voice low and troubled. "Do you know from what source I mean?" "I think I do." "I thought you did, else I am not sure that my pride would have allowed me to open my lips. Well, do you know there is something you might do to help him?" "Alice." "No, you are not to interrupt me. I don't mean anything insulting. There are ways of which I would be more sure, and they are connected with you, but I know they are out of the question. I am not going to talk of them. But there is something I want you to do. I want you to talk with mamma. It is of no use for me to say a word to her. There are family reasons why she is specially vexed with me just now, and will not listen reasonably to anything that I might say. But she respects you, and likes you. You have more or less influence over her. Are you willing to use it for Louis's sake?" "But, my dear Alice, I do not understand you in the least. What could I say to your mother that she does not already know? And in any case, how could she materially help your brother? He needs the help of his own will." "That is true, but there are ways in which mamma might help him, if she would. I can tell you of some. In the first place, you are mistaken as to her knowledge. She knows, it is true, that he takes more wine occasionally than is good for him, and has violent headaches in consequence. But she does not know that 2 nights in a week, at least, he comes home intoxicated. Isn't that a terrible thing to say of one's brother? What has become of the Ansted pride, when I can say it to almost a stranger?" "Why does not your mother know?" "Partly because she is blind, and partly because I have promised Louis not to tell her, and partly because there are reasons why it would be especially hard on my mother to have this knowledge brought to her through me. You see, there are reasons enough. Now for what she could do. Claire, she fairly drives him into temptation. There is a certain house in the city which she is very anxious to see united to ours. She contrives daily pretexts for sending Louis there, and it is almost impossible for him to go there without coming home the worse for liquor. I wish I could talk more plainly to you. I will tell you this. There is a brother as well as a sister in that house, and it has been a pet dream of my mother to exchange the sons and daughters. It is a romantic, old world scheme, grown up with the family from their early days, and mamma, who has never been accustomed to having her plans thwarted, is in danger of seeing all of these come to naught, and more than half believes that I am plotting against it for Louis, having first shown myself to be an undutiful and ungrateful daughter. Do you see how entirely my tongue is silenced? I wonder if you do understand?" "I understand, my dear friend, and I thank you for your confidence. But I do not see how a stranger can help, or indeed can interfere in any way, without being guilty of gross rudeness. How could I hope to approach your mother on such subjects as these without having her feel herself insulted?" Alice made a gesture of impatience. "You cannot," she said, "if you think more of the irritable words that a troubled mother may say to you than you do of a soul in peril. But I did not think you were of that sort." Claire waited a moment before replying. "I think I may be trusted to try to do what seems right, even though it were personally hard," she said at last, speaking very gently. "But, Alice, I do not understand how words of mine could do other than mischief." "I can show you. This family, I have told you, is a continual snare to Louis. He simply cannot go there without being led into great temptation, and mamma is responsible for the most of his visits. It would not be difficult for Louis to remain away, if mamma did not make errands for him. He would go abroad with the Hewsons next week, and be safe from this and many other temptations, or he would go to the Rocky Mountains with Harold Chessney, and he could not be in better society, if mamma would give her consent, and she would, if she could be made to realize his peril, if she knew that outsiders were talking about it. Don't you see? Now, who is going to enlighten her? I am not in favor, less so just at present than ever before. The girls, poor young things, do not know of our disgrace, and would have no influence with mamma if they did, and papa would like the alliance from a business point of view as well as mamma would from a romantic and fashionable one. Do you see the accumulation of troubles? And do you imagine, I wonder, what it is to me, when I have humbled myself to tell it all to you?" "And this young lady?" said Claire, ignoring the personal questions. "Do you feel sure that there is no hope of help from that source? Is not her interest deep enough and her influence strong enough to come to the rescue if she fully understood?" There was again that gesture of extreme impatience. "That young lady! She has no more character than a painted doll. Claire Benedict, she is in as great danger to-day as Louis is, and from the same source. She dances every night, and buoys up her flagging strength by stimulants every day. I have seen her repeatedly when she was so excited with wine that I knew she did not know what she was saying." "Is it possible?" This was Claire's startled exclamation. "It is not only possible, it is an almost daily occurrence. And she fills the glass with her own silly little hand, which trembles at the moment with the excitement of wine, and holds it to my brother, and he, poor foolish boy, accepts it because he knows that he likes it better than anything else in the world, at least that is attainable. Claire, if my mother could be prevailed upon to urge Louis to go away with Harold Chessney, I believe he might be saved." "Who is Harold Chessney?" "He is one of God's saints, made for the purpose of showing us what a man might be if he would. Claire Benedict, will you try?" End of chapter 22. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 23 of Interrupted by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. Unpalatable Truths. "Yes," said Claire, "I will try." But she said it with a long-drawn sigh. This was work that was utterly distasteful to her, and she saw but little hope of accomplishing anything by attempting it. She wanted to fight the demon of alcohol wherever found. At least, she had thought that she did. But who would have supposed that it could bring her into such strange contact with Mrs. Russell Ansted? In order that you may understand why this plan of rescue had suggested itself to Alice Ansted's mind, it will be necessary to explain that the acquaintance which had been commenced by accident had been allowed to mature into what might almost be called friendship. At least, it had pleased Mrs. Ansted to encourage the intimacy between her young people and the attractive music teacher. It is not as though she had been simply a music teacher and nothing else all her life, was Mrs. Ansted wont to explain to her city friends. She is a daughter of the Boston Benedicts, and, of course, her opportunities have been rare. She is simply faultless in her manners. The girls learn a great deal from her and are devoted to her, and she really is a charming companion. You know in the country we have no society." So Claire had been made almost oppressively welcome to the lovely house on the hill, and the sleigh or the carriage had been sent for her many times when she could not go, and in many kind and pleasant ways had the entire family sought to show their interest in her society. Mrs. Ansted, indeed, patronized her to such an extent that Alice had made herself imagine that in this direction might be found the light which would open the mother's eyes to certain things which she ought to see and did not. Claire did not share her hopes. She had always felt herself held back from real heart intimacy with the fair and worldly woman, had always detected the tinge of patronage in the kindness shown her, and had even smiled sometimes at the thought of how the very attentions which she received placidly, and in a sense gratefully, would chafe her hot-headed young sister Dora. It had given her joy of heart and cause for gratitude to realize that she herself had been lifted above such chafings. There were trials in her lot, but Mrs. Ansted's patronage was not one of them. Still it made her feel that little would be gained by attempted interference in her family affairs. Under the circumstances, she felt herself intrusive, yet determined to submit and thereby convince Alice of her willingness and powerlessness. The most she had to fear was a little drawing up of the aristocratic shoulders, and a cold and courteous hint that some things belonged exclusively to the domain of very close friendship. It was on the following Saturday that opportunity offered for an attempt. Claire was spending the day with the Ansteds. The invitation had come from the mother and was unusually cordial. Louis was in town, would probably remain over the Sabbath, and the girls were lonely. The mother did not know how much more readily the invitation was accepted because Louis was in town. They were in Mrs. Ansted's own sitting room. The girls had been called to the sewing room at the mandate of the dressmaker, and Alice, telegraphing Claire that now was her opportunity, slipped away. Have you ever observed how much harder it becomes to set about a delicate and embarrassing duty when circumstances have been carefully made for you, and you are left to stare in the face of the thought, "I am to do this thing now, it is expected of me"? Immediately, Claire began to feel that it would be preposterous in her to try to advise or enlighten Mrs. Ansted. But that lady unconsciously helped her by asking, "Did you ever meet Mr. Harold Chessney in Boston? I believe he calls that his home, though he is abroad a great deal. I wish he were abroad now, instead of planning an excursion to the Rocky Mountains and all sort of out-of-the-world places, and putting Louis into a fever to accompany him. I have a horror of those Western expeditions entered into by young men. Louis will not go contrary to my approval, however, so I need not worry about it. It is a great comfort to a mother to have a dutiful son, my dear." "It must be," Claire hastened to say, but added that she should think it would be a delightful trip for a young man, and a rare opportunity to see his own country. She was not personally acquainted with Mr. Chessney, but she had heard him very highly spoken of. "Oh, he is perfection, I suppose," Mrs. Ansted said carelessly. "Too perfect, my dear, for ordinary flesh and blood. He is very wealthy, and very eccentric; has innumerable ways for wasting his money on savages and all that sort of thing. I should really almost fear his influence over Louis, he is such an impressible boy. Harold might fancy it his duty to become a home missionary." This last was spoken with a little satisfied laugh, as though Louis Ansted's position was too well assured, after all, to suggest any reasonable fears of his sinking to the level of a home missionary. The matron speedily composed her face, however, and added, "Harold is a magnificent man, I have no doubt, and if Louis were a young man of depraved tendencies and low tastes, probably I should hope for nothing better than to exile him for a while with such a guard. But in his position, and with his prospects, the idea is, of course, absurd. I don't know what fancies Alice has in mind. The child seems quite to favor Louis's going. Alice is a little inclined to be fanatical, I am afraid, in some things. I hope you will not encourage such tendencies, my dear. I have seen with pleasure that she is becoming more interested in religion, and disposed to help poor Bud, though she has chosen some foolish ways of doing that. But still it is quite as it should be to rouse to the importance of these things. I have been pained with her indifference in the past. However, we should not carry anything to extremes, you know." They were not getting on. Claire did not feel like a diplomatist. She was disposed to be straightforward. Would not simple truth serve her purpose in this case? At least, it would be less humiliating than to try to worm herself into family confidences. So she spoke her plain question. "Mrs. Ansted, has it never seemed to you that it would be well for Louis to get away for a time from some of his associates who tempt him in the direction in which he is least able to bear temptation?" Plain English was not palatable, or else it was not understood. 2 red spots glowed on the mother's cheek, but her eyes were cold. "And what is that, if you please? I was not aware that my son was particularly susceptible to any temptation." Could this be true? Did she not know that he was tempted to reel home at midnight like a common drunkard? If so, what an awful revelation for a stranger to make! Claire hesitated, and the lady looked steadily at her and waited. Simple truth should serve her again. It would be insulting to offer anything else. "Mrs. Ansted, you will pardon me for referring to it, but I know from your son's own statements that he is tempted in the direction of liquor, and that he finds it hard to resist these temptations, and I am afraid he is in great danger. If I were his mother, and had confidence in this Mr. Chessney, I should beg him to go out with him, and break away from his present surroundings." She was deceived in the mother, in the calm with which she listened to these words. She did not cry out like one amazed and hurt, nor did she look like one who was being shocked into a faint. And Claire, watching her, hurried on, determined to make her disagreeable revelations as brief as she could, and then to get away from the subject. Surely the mother could not feel much humiliated before her when she confessed that she had received these intimations from the son. But directly her voice ceased, the mother arose, her own tones low and ladylike as usual. "I am not aware, Miss Benedict, that our kind treatment of you can have furnished any excuse for this direct and open insult. I did not know that you had succeeded in securing my son's confidence to such a degree that he had been led to traduce his friends. I cannot imagine his motive, but allow me to say that yours is plain, and will fail. The lady to whom Mr. Louis Ansted has been paying special attention for years cannot be thrown off, even by his taking a trip to the Rocky Mountains. And if you hope to ingratiate yourself in the mother's heart by trying to arouse her fears, you have made a grievous mistake. My daughters are evidently more susceptible, and I now understand some things that were before mysterious to me. I am sorry for you, Miss Benedict. I can well imagine that it is a hard thing to be poor, but it is a pity to add disgrace to poverty. You have been unwise to try to work up fanatical ideas on my son. We are none of us temperance fanatics." There was a dangerous fire in Claire's eyes, but she struggled to keep back the words that hurried forward, clamoring to be spoken. This woman before her was old enough to be her mother, and was the mother of a young man whom she would try to save. Besides, she had the force of habit to help her. The controlled voice which belongs to the cultured lady, even under trying provocation, was as much a part of her as it was of Mrs. Ansted. "I will pass by your personalities, Mrs. Ansted, as unworthy of you, and ask you to pardon my apparent intrusion into family affairs, on the sole ground that I have come into possession of some knowledge concerning your son's danger, which I have reason to believe you do not possess, and I thought I ought, as a Christian woman, to warn you." Mrs. Ansted was already repenting of some of her words, beginning, that is, to realize that she had been unnecessarily insulting to a guest in her own home, and one whom her son, as well as her daughters, liked and admired. She was not less angry, but more controlled. "Possibly you mean well," she said, dropping into the patronizing tone which was habitual, "and I may have spoken too plainly in my haste. A mother's feelings, when she considers the characters of her children insulted, are sometimes not sufficiently held in check. We will conclude, Miss Benedict, that your motive was good, though your words were unfortunate, and your conclusions unwarrantable. My son is entirely capable of taking care of himself. If you are really sincere in supposing him to be in danger, because he takes an occasional glass of wine, it only proves you to be lamentably ignorant of the customs of polite society. And now I must beg you to excuse me. Excitement always wearies me, and I feel that I must lie down for a while. I presume my daughter will be in soon." And Claire was left alone to gather her startled thoughts and determine what to do next. She was greatly excited. In all her imaginings of a mother's heart, nothing of this kind had occurred. It had been a serious failure, as she had feared it would be, but not of the kind which she had planned. She looked about her for paper on which to write a line to Alice, then determined that she would do no such thing, lest Alice might have to bear blame in consequence. She would just slip away quietly, and go home and think. It was not clear in her mind what ought to be said to Alice. She had been insulted, and by Alice's mother, and she could not longer remain a guest in the house, but perhaps it was not necessary that Alice should know all this. She must wait, and think, and pray. At least, it would not be wise to make any expression about Mrs. Ansted until she could think less bitterly of the words spoken to her, for it was by no means a pleasant thing to be misjudged, and it is especially difficult to keep one's mouth closed when one has that to tell which would silence all the hints forever. It had required all the self-control which Claire possessed not to tell Mrs. Ansted to ask her son whether the insinuations which had been flung at her meant anything. Certainly she was not in the mood to have an interview with Alice. She hastily and quietly possessed herself of her wraps, and stole out of the house and down the avenue which had in the few weeks past become so familiar to her. Bud saw her from the distant stables, but he only made her a most respectful bow. It was no strange sight to him. He knew that she came and went often during these days. He did not know that she was thinking that in all probability she would never walk down that avenue again. There is no use explaining to you that she cried when she reached home. Cried bitterly and with a perfect abandon, as though her heart were broken. She was young and had not had many hard words to bear, and all her sharp thrusts from life had come upon her lately. Her knowledge of human nature had been increasing with painful rapidity, and there were times when she shrank from it all and wanted to go to her father. But after the crying, or indeed in the very midst of it, she prayed. For herself first, she felt so sore and ill-used and friendless. Then for Louis Ansted, the special danger and the special friendlessness of a man with such a mother took hold of her with power, and at last she prayed for the mother, not at her, but for her. There is a way of praying about a soul with whom we are offended, or at least we call it praying, which is simply pouring out one's knowledge of that person's shortcomings in an almost vindictive way before the one whom we almost unconsciously feel ought to come to our help and administer rebuke. Claire honestly prayed for Louis Ansted's mother. Her eyes must be opened, but how? Must it be that they were to be opened by the utter ruin of her only son? That this might not be necessary, Claire prayed, and rose up presently, almost forgetful that she had received deep wounds, and quite ready to shield that mother's shortcomings from her children. End of chapter 23. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 24 of Interrupted by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. Recognition. And now I desire you to imagine the worshippers gathered one morning in the little church at South Plains. The winter over and gone, the time of the singing of birds and of sweet-scented flowers had come. The marvel of the annual resurrection from the grave of winter was being lived over again in nature. But within the sanctuary it seemed more than resurrection, almost creation. Was it the same church at all? What had become of the dusty floors, and the smoky walls, and the rusty stovepipe, and the smoking stoves, and the square table, and the swaying, faded red curtains, and the faded and worn ingrain rag which covered the platform, and the dust, and the rust, and the dreariness? What a strange effect that paper of a quiet tint, and yet with a suggestion of sunlight in it, had on those hitherto bare and smoky walls! How high the frescoing made the ceiling look! What an excellent imitation of real were the carefully grained seats! How perfectly the carpet harmonized in pattern and coloring with the paper on the walls! Small wonder this last, if you had known how many patient hours Mama and Dora had spent in reaching the important decision, which shall we send? As for the pulpit, it was real, without any paint about it, and so neat and pretty and graceful that the girls had exhausted all adjectives on it. And really the stovepipe, though it wandered about according to some wild freak that was considered necessary in order to draw, did not look so objectionable now that it was real Russia, and nothing could glow more brilliantly than the stoves, which smoked no more. Engineer Bud had been a success. Still, I know that I cannot make you realize the difference in that church, unless you were there on that dreary winter morning when Claire Benedict first looked upon it with utter sinking of heart, and then were there again on that spring morning, and caught the breath of the flowers, and saw the shimmer of awakened life over everything within and without. You will never understand it. Unless, indeed, you look up some other man-forsaken sanctuary, and try the delightful experiment of transformation. There were those in South Plains who knew and felt the difference. They gathered softly, the worshippers, the men on tiptoe, though they need not have done that, for the heavy carpet gave back no sound of footfall, but it was one of their ways of expressing admiration and reverence. They gave quick, admiring, amazed glances about them, then riveted their eyes, as the workers had meant they should, on the motto which glowed before them, strung from lamp to lamp in some spirit-like fashion which those unacquainted with the management of silverware cannot comprehend, and which made the triumphant announcement, "The Lord is in his holy temple." And I tell you that, so much has the outward and tangible to do with our spiritual vision, there were those present who grasped this stupendous fact for the first time. The organ squeaked no more. It had only been a matter of a drop of oil which quieted that, and yet the congregation had actually sat under its squeak almost for years. So many things in this world squeak for the want of a thoughtful hand to administer a drop of oil. Then the choir, that almost hardest thing in country or city to manage successfully, had been transformed. There had been no violent wrenches. Occasionally it happens that a combination of circumstances bring about unlooked-for and delightful results. The discordant alto had married, bless her, and gone to another town. The flatting tenor had sprained his ankle, poor man, and must needs abide at home. The tremendous bass had that rare quality, common sense, and discovered on the evening of the concert that South Plains had taken a musical prize, and was himself the one to propose that Miss Benedict and her class should be invited to join the choir, and further, that Miss Benedict should be requested to drill the choir, and had put himself under training, and his voice being really grand, He bade fair, under culture, to become the power in song that God designed. I do not know whether it was accident or blessed design that the much astonished, much encouraged young old minister, in a new coat which was an Easter gift from the young men of his congregation, read the hymn, I love her gates, I love the road, the church adorned with grace, stands like a palace built for God to show his milder face. But I know that he read it as that people had never heard him read a hymn before, with an unction and a quiver of feeling which said almost as plainly as words, The Lord reigneth, and this is his holy temple, and I am his chosen mouthpiece to this people. I had almost forgotten it, but it is so. Then when that reconstructed choir rolled out the words, led by the center voice of exquisite melody and power, the worshippers felt the sentiment of the hymn fill their hearts, and admitted that they did love her gates, and that they must rouse up and show their love as they had not done heretofore. Ah, there was more in that church that day than new carpet and new furniture and paint and paper and light and beauty. These were all well enough, and Claire Benedict's sense of the fitness of things rejoiced in them all. But what were they to the thrill in her heart as she heard the minister read among the names announced for reception into the visible communion of the church, that of Hubbard Myers? There were some who did not know to whom the name belonged. And it was not surprising. For Hubbard Myers had been called only Bud for so many years, the wonder was that he remembered his name himself. There had been great astonishment among some, and not a little shaking of heads, when Bud presented himself as a candidate for church membership. It had not been supposed that he had intellect enough to understand the meaning of the step. There was close questioning on the part of the minister, not for himself alone, but for the enlightenment of others. But before the examination closed, more than one of the listeners drew out their red handkerchiefs and blew their noses suspiciously, and at last, one of the most stolid of them remarked, It is my opinion, brethren, that the boy has been taught of God, and I think we would do well to accept him without any further delay. And they did. There were other trophies. Where would be the Church of Christ without its living, working members? One who was pledged to prefer Jerusalem above her chief joy, had not been, and in the very nature of the case, could not have been, content with toiling simply for the outward adorning of the temple. A history of the quiet work which had been done in hearts during that one winter would fill a volume. I have but given you a hint of it here and there. The head of the church has the complete record. There is perhaps little need that I should try to give you even scattered notes of it. Yet there was one name which made the tears come very near to falling, as Claire listened for it, fearful that it might not come, and at the same moment hopeful for it. It was only a transferal from a church in the city to membership with the one at South Plains, and it was only Alice Ansted. Her parents were not even present in the church, but Claire knew that a visible union with the Church of Christ meant to Alice Ansted today what it never had before, and she knew that the two girls, Fanny and Ella Ansted, who sat and cried in the pew beside Alice, were only left out because parental authority had asserted itself and said they were not to come. Claire knew that they had united themselves with the great Head, and were members of the church in the Jerusalem which is above and is free. They could afford to bide their time. And there was another still which gave Claire's heart a particular thrill of joy. Not that his name was read, or that many, as yet, knew about Satan's defeat with him. It had been recent, and the public recognition of the fact was yet to come. But the Lord Jesus Christ knew, for he had been the victor. It was only the night before, as they were about to leave the reconstructed church, and Mary Burton, with a long-drawn breath of repressed excitement, had declared that everything was ready for tomorrow, and that the victory was complete, that Harry Matthews had bent toward Claire and murmured, "Miss Benedict, there has been another victory. You will know that it is far more wonderful than this. He has undertaken for me." There had only been time to grasp his hand and flash back an answer from sympathetic eyes, but there was a song in her heart this morning over the news. Occasionally she glanced at Harry, and told herself that she would have known, just to look at him, that the highest experience this life has for us had come to him. The little church was unusually full on this triumphant morning, and yet most of the faces were known to Claire. Strangers were not frequent at South Plains. Yet there was one, a gentleman, who gave that reverent heed to the service which even among strangers distinguishes those who really join in worship from those who merely look on. This man joined, and with his heart. Claire was sure of it. It was this man that Harry Matthews watched, a satisfied smile on his face the while. Harry could imagine just how surprised the stranger was. On the evening before, when he had reached his room, after giving his wonderful news to Claire, instead of finding it in darkness, his kerosene lamp had been turned to the highest capacity, and a gentleman sat in front of his little stove, feeding it from time to time, apparently for the sole purpose of brightening the somewhat dismal room. "Hallo!" had been Harry's greeting. "Just so," was the quiet response. "You did not know you had company, did you, my boy?" And then there had been such eager grasping of hands, and such lighting up of faces, as evinced the satisfaction of both parties at meeting. For this was Harry Matthews's favorite uncle, and he must lately have come from the home where Harry's mother waited for him. Of course there was a high tide of question and answer at once. It was not until an hour afterward that Harry reached the subject of which he had instantly thought on seeing his uncle. "Uncle Harold, didn't you know the Benedicts?" "What Benedicts?" "Why, the Boston ones, Sidney L. He failed and died less than a year ago. Don't you remember?" "I remember. I knew him well. I met him abroad." "And didn't you know his daughter?" "I knew that he had a daughter, and, in fact, I think I saw her once, but we were not acquainted." "Why, I wonder?" "Why?" with a slightly curious laugh. "There might be many reasons, I am sure. Boston spreads over a good deal of ground. Besides, you know I never spent a great deal of time in Boston, and I am not a society man. Why do you ask?" "No reason in particular, only the lady is here, and I thought if you were old acquaintances, it would be pleasant to meet her." "Here in South Plains? What in the world is she doing here?" "Teaching music." "I wonder if this is where she has hidden herself. I occasionally hear queries as to what has become of her, but I believe I never met a person who knew. No, I don't suppose there would be any mutual pleasure in a meeting. I may be said to be a stranger. I have not the least idea how she looks. And I may never have met her, though I think I did somewhere. I remember having a passing interest in seeing how a daughter of Sidney Benedict would look. He was a grand man, but I suspected that his daughter was a butterfly of fashion. She lived in the very center of that sort of thing, and her father was supposed to have immense wealth. I suppose she is a poor, crushed little morsel, done up in crape and disappointment. I am always sorry for music scholars who have to take broken-down ladies for teachers. Still, I don't know but I would like to shake hands with her for her father's sake. Have you met her?" "I should say I had, but I don't believe you ever have. You couldn't draw such a queer picture of her as that if you had ever seen her. She doesn't wear crape at all. Somebody told me she did not believe in mourning for people who had gone to heaven. At least, not in putting on black clothes and looking doleful, you know. And as to being crushed, why, Uncle Harold, she is the brightest, sweetest, grandest girl I ever heard of in all my life." "Possible!" said his uncle, with a good-humored laugh. "Why, my boy, she must be several years older than you. What does this mean?" "Oh, nonsense!" was the impatient reply of the excited young man. "It is just as evident as can be that you don't know what you are talking about. If you had been here this winter and watched things work, and known the hand that she had in it all, why, look here, you wait until tomorrow. I can show you a few things, I fancy." whereupon he immediately closed his lips, and although his uncle pretended to be extremely curious, and to be unable to wait until morning for light, no hints or questions could draw out further information in the same direction. End of chapter 24. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 25 of Interrupted by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. Dangers Seen and Unseen. It was this man, then, to whom Harry Matthews' eyes often wandered during that morning service. The look of profound amazement which had settled on his uncle's face after the first sweeping glance which he gave the little church had caused Harry the keenest satisfaction. The more so that during the morning he had been addressed after this fashion. The only regret I had, when I found out that I could drop off at South Plains and spend a day or two, was that it was Saturday, and the Sabbath would have to be spent in that forlorn little box where you go to church. I have vivid recollections of the day I spent with you a year ago. Harry, my boy, I don't like to think of your Sabbaths being passed amid such unpleasant surroundings. I shall be glad when your engagement here closes. You don't think of renewing it, I hope? I have plans which I want to talk over with you tomorrow. But Harry had been too full of the surprise in store to make any reply to these questionings other than to say, "Come on, Uncle Harold, I sing in the choir, and I promise to be there in good time." None the less was he watching for that first look, and it satisfied him. He wanted to laugh outright, but of course he did no such thing. Instead, he seated his amazed relative in one of the best pews, then took his place in the choir, all of his face, save his eyes, in decorous repose. All the bright Sabbath afternoon they sat together, uncle and nephew, the one an eager narrator, the other an attentive listener. Every step of the colossal plan, as it appeared to others, and was matured and carried out by the unfaltering zeal of Claire Benedict, was detailed for the uncle's benefit. And certainly Claire's reputation did not suffer in the young man's hands. He could not help glorifying her. None knew better than he what she had been to him, but of this more sacred story he as yet said nothing. Its time was to come. "Why, Uncle Harold, you remember Bud," he burst forth afresh after a moment's silence. "That queer fellow who worked for the Ansteds. He came down here that night you spent here last spring, with papers, you know, for Mr. Ansted, and you talked with him a little, and laughed so over his queer notions. Remember? Well, sir, that fellow is simply made over. It is a great deal more wonderful than the church. We used to think he was not more than half-witted. I'll tell you what it is. I shouldn't wonder if it turned out that he was double-witted. You didn't recognize his name today, of course. It is a wonder that he did himself. Hubbard Myers, that's the boy. Yes, sir, he has joined the church, and a help he will be to it, too. Uncle Harold, you ought to hear him pray. He says queer things even in prayer. At least they sound queer, but in spite of yourself, you cannot help wondering sometimes whether it is not because he has gotten ahead of all the rest, and sees things that they don't understand. I believe he thinks Miss Benedict is an angel sent here from heaven to help him. That's no wonder, though. Perhaps she is. Anyhow, she has helped him as well, and perhaps better than a real angel could have done, and she is the first one who ever took any notice of him, or remembered that he had a soul. It is no special wonder that the uncle was deeply interested in this story. It told more than Harry suspected. How came this gay young fellow, who had cost him many sleepless nights, to be sufficiently familiar with a prayer-meeting to know who prayed or how? He studied the bright face before him most attentively. It was changed, certainly. He had felt the change in the boy all day. What was it? How much did it mean? There had certainly been a need for change. It made his heart beat fast to think of Harry's mother, and the possibility of news for her such as would make her feel young again. "Harry," he said gently, "do you know, I half hope that I have not heard the best yet of this wonderful story; that there has been another making over. How is it, my boy?" A bright flush mantled Harry's face as he bent his eyes closer over the paper on which he was scribbling his own and his uncle's names with all sorts of flourishes. Suddenly he raised his head, and looked full into the kind eyes bent wistfully on him, and smiled. "I don't know why I should hesitate to tell you that, I am sure," he said, speaking in a firm, manly tone. "It is true enough. I have been made over, I believe. Certainly nobody ever needed it more, and nobody ever struggled harder against it, as you very well know. At least, you know part. But I have been lower down than you think, Uncle Harold. Talk about angels! I know that I don't see how any angel can ever do more for me than Miss Benedict has done. I've engaged for life as a servant of the Lord Jesus Christ, and I owe more to Miss Benedict this minute than I do to any human being, not excepting even you and my mother." The uncle was out of his chair by this time, one hand on the shoulder of his dear boy, while he held out the other, which was promptly grasped. But he could not speak yet, and he could not see for the tears. This young fellow was very dear to him, and the waiting had been long. "God bless you!" he said at last, his lips quivering, and unable to utter another word. When he could speak again, he said, "My dear boy, have you told your mother?" "Not yet," said Harry, his eyes shining, "but you can be sure that I am going to. You see, Uncle Harold, the articles of surrender were only signed, sealed, and delivered, night before last, in the middle of the night. Since then I have not had a moment's time that belonged to me. But I'll write her such a letter as she has never had from me." While the uncle walked the parlor of the boarding-house, and waited for his nephew to make ready for evening service, he had some questions to settle which were personal. He became aware of the fact that he had certainly jumped to conclusions regarding some of the workers in the master's vineyard which were apparently without foundation. Here was this Miss Benedict. He had heard her name mentioned frequently in the days gone by, and always as one of the dependences of the church to which she belonged, and yet he had always thought of her with curling lip. Workers, he had told himself, being mentally very sarcastic. Yes, didn't all the initiated know what that meant when applied to a fashionable young lady who lived in an elegant home and mingled with the fashionable world? It meant that she helped at the fancy fairs and festivals and bazaars and what not; worked them up, probably, with all their accompanying train of evils. It meant that she was a district visitor, perhaps, and left a tract on redeeming the time in a home where they were starving for lack of employment and needed a loaf of bread. He had seen workers of that sort, and he found it difficult to feel for them anything but contempt. The thing for which he was now to take himself to task was the fact that he had classed Claire Benedict among these, knowing nothing of her, meantime, save that she was a member of a fashionable uptown church, and that, too, after knowing her father and singling him out as a man among thousands. The simple truth was that he had imagined a character of which he disapproved, and named it Claire Benedict, and then let himself disapprove of her heartily. The sole thing that I know about the young woman is that she was once wealthy, and on this account I have judged her as I have, and I find that it is what I am apt to do. This was what he told himself as he walked the length of that little parlor and waited. He was much ashamed of himself. "It is an excellent standpoint from which to judge character," he said severely. "If there is any justice in it, I must be a worthless person myself. I wonder how many people are setting me down as one who merely plays at Christian work because my father left me one fortune and my old aunt another." I am glad that this man had this severe talk with himself. He needed it. The truth is, he was very apt to judge of people in masses, as though they were specimens and belonged to certain types. The conclusion of his self-examination at this time was, that he declared that if 1/3 of what Harry thought about this young person was true, it had taught him a lesson. He went to church that evening, apparently for the purpose of studying the lesson more thoroughly. At least, he gave some attention to the organist. He had recognized her in the morning, because she had eyes like her father, and this evening he decided that her head was shaped like his, and that she had the firm mouth and yet sweet set of lips that had characterized the father, and he told himself that he might have known that the daughter of such a man would be an unusual woman. After service was concluded, he walked deliberately forward and claimed acquaintance with Sidney Benedict's daughter. The glow that he brought to her face, and the tender light which shone in her eyes, when he mentioned that dear father's name, gave him a glimpse of what the daughter's memories were. Harry came up to them eagerly, having been detained by the pastor for a moment. "You have introduced yourself, Uncle Harold, I see. Miss Benedict, I wanted my Uncle Harold to know you for very special reasons." Uncle Harold was unaccountably embarrassed. What a strange thing for that boy to say! And what did he propose to say next? But Claire relieved the embarrassment, and plunged him into a maze of questioning, by the sudden, eager interest which flashed in her face with the mention of his name. "Are you Harold Chessney?" she asked, as though a new thought came to her with the union of the two names. "And are you going to the Rocky Mountains?" "I am Harold Chessney," he said, smiling, "and I have in mind a trip to the Rocky Mountains, if I can make my plans in that direction what I wish. But why this should be of interest to you passes my comprehension." Of course this last he thought. She did not leave him long in doubt. "Is Louis Ansted going with you?" "He is if I can prevail upon him to do so. That is part of my errand here at this time, and has to do with the plans I mentioned." And now his face plainly asked the question, "Why do you care?" She seemed to answer the look. "He needs to go, Mr. Chessney. He needs help, such help as perhaps you can give him. I don't know. Something must be done for him, and that soon. Mr. Chessney, I hope you will succeed." There was no time for more. Alice Ansted came up and claimed the stranger as an acquaintance, and stood talking with him for a moment, and expressed extreme anxiety that he should find her brother in the city the next day. "He is somewhere in town, but we never know where. Still, I could give you a dozen addresses, at any one of which you might find him. I hope you will not return without seeing him." "I shall not," Mr. Chessney said, decidedly. "Is he inclined to accompany me, do you think? Has he mentioned to you my designs?" "Yes, and would go if it were not for... Mr. Chessney, if you could make mamma understand. No one seems able to. Claire Benedict has tried and failed, and what she fails in perhaps cannot be done. I don't know, but something must be done, and that speedily." Almost Claire Benedict's words repeated. The newcomer walked home in almost silence. As they neared Harry's door, he said, "What is young Ansted about just now?" "Drinking hard, sir. He is running downhill very fast. If you don't get him away with you, I am afraid he will go to the dogs in a hurry." "Is he still on terms of special intimacy with the Van Marters?" "Well, as to that, I do not know. Things look mixed. He rails against Willis Van Marter once in a while, when he has been taking enough to make him imprudent, and Miss Alice seems to have broken with them altogether. At least, Willis does not come out any more, I think, and Miss Alice is not in town often. But Mrs. Ansted seems to be as intimate with them as ever, and Louis goes there with his mother. I don't know anything about it, but it looks like a house divided against itself. And if I had such a mother as Louis Ansted has, I don't believe I would try to be anybody." "Mothers don't seem to count for much sometimes, my boy." You mean with their sons, and I dare say you mean me, Uncle Harold, but it is not true. My mother always counted for 10 times more than you think. It was she who held me back. If Louis Ansted had a 10th part of the craving for liquor that I have, with his mother to push him, he would have been gone long ago, beyond reach. I don't know but he is now. He has been going down very fast in the last few weeks." "What is the accelerating cause?" "That I don't positively know. Partly it is the natural result of a bad habit indulged, I suppose. But there are other influences at which I can guess. Still, it is pure guesswork. I am not in anyone's confidence, except when Louis has been drinking too much he says to me things that he would not want me to know if he were sober, and those of course I don't repeat. I think that his mother is bent on this union of the 2 houses, Van Marter's and theirs, and I think neither Louis nor Miss Alice are of her mind in the matter. And I think, moreover, that Louis would rather have an hour of Miss Benedict's society than a lifetime of Miss Eva Van Marter's, and I don't think he can get what he wants. Now, isn't that an interesting little romance for a young fellow like me to think out, especially when I don't know a thing about it? The only fact is that Louis Ansted is in great danger, and nobody seems to have much influence over him, at least, nobody who uses it in the right direction." "His sister seems to be roused. I was surprised to hear her speak as she did." "His sister is not the woman she was when you saw her last. She has been under Miss Benedict's influence all winter." "Evidently you incline to the belief that Miss Benedict is a remarkable woman," his uncle said with a slight laugh. "Why has she not been exerting her influence to help poor Louis?" "She has tried as hard as a woman can. But, Uncle Harold, she is not the sort of woman to promise to marry a man merely to save him from becoming a drunkard." "I should hope not," Mr. Chessney answered promptly. End of Chapter 25. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 26 of Interrupted by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. An Escaped Victim. In the quiet of Harry's own room, his uncle, having spent 15 minutes in silent and apparently puzzled thought, suddenly asked a question. "When did Louis go into town?" "Several days ago. He has a way of disappearing suddenly, not giving the family an idea of where he is going or when he expects to return, and when he does get back he shows to anyone who is not blind that he has been pretty low down." "They expect him back tomorrow?" "Why, as to that, they have been expecting him ever since he went away. I heard Miss Alice say that he went unexpectedly, leaving word that he should probably be back to dinner." "Harry, my boy, I am almost inclined to think that I ought to start out tonight and try to look him up." "Tonight? Why, Uncle Harold, how could you? It would be midnight and after before you could reach the city, and then where would you go? The addresses that Miss Alice can give you must be respectable places with closed doors tonight." "That is true," Mr. Chessney answered, after a thoughtful pause. "It would be a wild kind of proceeding, apparently, with very little excuse, and yet I am some way impressed that it is the thing to do." Alas for the Christian world, which believes in theory that there is a direct link between the seen and the unseen, by which the earnest soul can be told in what way to walk, and, in practice, thinks it must search out its own way. Mr. Chessney did not go out in search of his friend. He did not even ask his master whether it was his will that the apparently wild proceeding should be attempted. He prayed it was true, and he prayed for Louis Ansted, but only in a general way, and he retired to rest, saying within himself that directly after breakfast he would go into town and see what he could do. Before he was awake the next morning, the piazza of the little country hotel where he stopped was filled with loungers who had something unusual and exciting to talk about. There were a dozen different stories, it is true, but out of them all the interested listener could glean certain things which were painfully likely to be facts. There had been a runaway, to that all parties agreed, and Louis Ansted had been in the carriage and had been thrown, but whether he was killed, or only seriously hurt, or whether the horse had taken fright at the approaching train, or whether the driver had attempted to cross the railroad track in the face of the train, or whether there had been any train at all, authorities differed. It was still early when Harry Matthews knocked at his uncle's door with the confused particles of story. "And you don't know whether he is living or not?" asked the startled uncle, who was now making his toilet with all possible speed. "No, I can't find out. Some of them say he was killed instantly, and others have it that he was only stunned, and has revived. It may be nothing but a scare. South Plains has so little excitement that it is apt to make as much as it can out of everything. Uncle Harold, I can't go up there and find out, for my train will be due in 5 minutes, and I must be at the telegraph office, you know." "Yes, I will be down in less than 5 minutes, and will go immediately up there. I hope it is chiefly talk." Yet when he was left alone, he said aloud and mournfully, "If I had only followed my impressions last night." He had occasion to say it, or at least to think it, often, in the days which followed. South Plains had not exaggerated this time. Louis Ansted was not dead, at least, the heart was beating, but he lay a bruised, unconscious heap among the snowy draperies of his bed. His soiled and matted clothing, which as yet they had not dared remove, telling to the practiced eye a story of more than a mere runaway. The skillful doctor, who had already been summoned from the city, was silent as well as skillful. He issued his orders in as few words as possible, and kept his own counsel, until, left alone with Mr. Chesney for a moment, in answer to the question, "What does this stupor mean?" he shook his head. "Hard to tell. It was on him before the accident, if that gives you any light." It gave him a bitter light, and made him groan in spirit over the fact that he had been tempted to go out in the night and hunt for his friend, and had not gone. Later in the day, bits of the facts came to him. Louis Ansted had been alone, had hired a horse at the livery and started for home. More under the influence of liquor than usual, perhaps, the reluctant ostler at the livery had admitted. Still, I thought he would get through all right. For the rest, the silent lips on the bed told no tales. He had been found, not very far from the railroad crossing, lying under a tree, and the horse had made his way back to the stables. Whether a train had frightened the animal, or whether being left to himself while the driver sank into a drunken sleep had caused his alarm, or how the accident had occurred, was left to conjecture. His mother continually repeated the story, and succeeded in making herself believe it, that a vicious horse had been given him, who evidently became unmanageable at the sound of the locomotive, but some of the listeners went out and said that there was no train passing between the hours that the horse left the stables and returned there, and the doctor shrugged his shoulders and said nothing. Then followed one of those periods of waiting and watching which some people know all about, the miseries of which can only be understood by having to live them. The trip to the Rocky Mountains was indefinitely postponed, and Harold Chesney, having made a journey to the city and rearranged his business, returned to take his place among the watchers. He was fully roused now. So were all the friends of the sufferer. His body was in danger. It was not at all difficult to make his mother understand this, and no means were left untried by which the frail shell might possibly be rescued from impending ruin. In this way passed weeks, while the soul of the injured man hovered on the edge of another world. Gradually the excitement in the village calmed down, and everywhere outside of that house on the hill everyday life went on again. Mr. Chesney came and went, keeping a hand on his business interests where he must, but keeping the most of his thoughts and the most of his time waiting, in the hope that consciousness would return once more to the wreck on the bed. There was one other who watched and waited too, though she could not now go to the house to inquire. She could pray, and this she did. Sometimes it seemed to her that every thought was a prayer for that periled soul. And often she, too, had to think, what if I had been more anxious, and earnest, and constant, while the body was comparatively in health? Might not things possibly have been different? It was in the middle of the night, and Mr. Chesney sat alone with the sick man. There was nothing to do but wait, and he had prevailed upon other weary watchers to rest, and let him take his turn. So there was only himself to be startled by a low voice from one who had been for so many weeks speechless. "Harold, is it you?" Great was the rejoicing in the troubled home the next morning. Louis was awake and conscious, knew them all, smiled feebly on his mother, and watched hungrily every movement of Mr. Chesney. The worst was over. He would gain rapidly now. So the mother said, with eager voice and joyful eyes. Alice looked up questioningly, when Mr. Chesney remained silent and grave, and as soon as opportunity came, asked her anxious question. "Mr. Chesney, I can see that you do not share mamma's joy. Do you think the indications unfavorable?" "I don't know, Miss Ansted. I am not a physician, only a nurse, and I hope I may be mistaken. But it is true that I am anxious." And the doctor, when he came, expressed no surprise and no pleasure over the change. "But then he is so utterly unimpressible," said the mother. "One might almost as well have a marble statue for a physician." Yet the statue worked faithfully and tirelessly, and, it must be confessed, hopelessly. To Mr. Chesney he would talk occasionally, and there came a day when that gentleman followed him out to the lawn. "Doctor, what do you think?" "That it is a charming morning." "Doctor, is our patient gaining?" "No." "Is there hope that he will in time?" "No." "Do you mean that you have no hope of his recovery?" "None at all. Have not had from the first. Brains like his never recover from such treatment as they have received." "But, doctor, this is very sudden. Do you mean that he will lie there helpless for the rest of his life?" "I don't think he will lie there 3 weeks longer, but he may. We are not infallible. I shall have to hasten this morning. Young Marshall came home in a drunken rage last night and kicked his wife, and she is going to die, I think. I don't know what we doctors would do if this were not a free country, and liquor sellers had not a right to kill by inches all the people they choose. This victim over whom you are watching is only one of many. That ought to comfort the friends, ought it not? Good morning." "I haven't told them," said Mr. Chesney 2 hours later, speaking to Claire. He had come out to get a breath of the sweet morning air, and to give Claire the news. During the weeks past, he had been very thoughtful of her anxiety, and very careful that she should receive daily bulletins. "I have not told them, but I must. Miss Benedict, this is the hardest task a man ever has to do. How can I tell that mother that she has robbed herself of her son? She has steadily thwarted for 2 years every scheme that I devised to help him, and she did not know what she was about, either, poor mother." "Did you ever try to tell her?" "Yes, and failed as you did. Alice told me of your effort. But I ought to have tried again. I knew she was deceived. She thought me a fanatic, and I could have told her of scenes that would have made one of her. I shrank from it." It was more than 2 weeks before she saw him again. During this time she twice received little twisted slips of paper, brought to her by the faithful Bud, and on them would be written a request that she would pray for a soul in peril. One long letter, blistered with tears, Alice wrote to her. the burden of it being the same. And this was all she knew of what was passing in the house on the hill. She had not entered it since that day when its mistress turned from her. Not that she would not quickly have done so, had occasion arisen, but there seemed no need to force herself on the poor mother. "I shall never see him again," she told herself sorrowfully, "and I have seen him so many times when I might have tried to help him, and did not." Then there came one brief, never to be forgotten note, written hurriedly by Mr. Chesney. "I believe that Louis rests in the everlasting arms." One Saturday morning she was summoned to the parlor to see Mr. Chesney. He came forward quickly, with an anxious air, as of one having a request to make which he feared might not be granted. "I have come for you," he said. "Louis wants to see you. I have been charged to bring you back with me, if possible. I wish I could save you from this ordeal. Do you shrink from it very much?" "No," she said with quiet gravity. "Only as one shrinks from seeing errors that one is powerless to help. Why am I wanted, Mr. Chesney? What can I do?" "I do not know. Louis wants you. He wishes to see you and his mother and his sister Alice together, and I shall have to add that he wants me to be present. I tried to spare you all this last, but he grew excited over it." "I would quite as soon have you present," Claire said, with gentle wonder. She did not understand why it was supposed to be a time of special trial to her individually. If she could have heard Mrs. Ansted's voice in confidential talk with Mr. Chesney, she would have been enlightened. "The girl is well enough, Mr. Chesney, and she has been of help to some of the lower classes here during the winter. I have nothing against her. On the contrary, I would like to shield her. The simple fact is, she has become too deeply interested in my son. It is not strange, I am sure, but it is sad. And that is why I do not wish Alice to have her here at this time. As a mother, it is my duty to shield the girl, though I must say she showed very little consideration for a mother's feelings when she talked with me." All this, and much more, which Mr. Chesney weighed, putting his nephew's views beside them, and came to the conclusion that there was an attachment between the two young people which had not been smiled upon by their elders. Although Claire knew nothing of this, her appearance in the sick room was attended with sufficient embarrassment. Mrs. Ansted received her with a sort of grave tolerance, as one who was humoring the whim of a sick man, and doing violence to her own sense of propriety thereby. But the change in Louis Ansted was so great, that, after the first moment, it held Claire's thoughts, to the exclusion of all trivial things. He held toward her a thin and trembling hand, as he said, "It was good in you to come. I have changed a great deal since that night you refused to ride with me, haven't I? Yes, I have changed since then. Has Harold told you that I have found help at last?" "He has told me wonderful and blessed news of you," Claire said, taking the chair that Mr. Chesney brought to the bedside. "I do not need to tell you how glad I was to hear it." "No, you don't, that is true. You have given ample proof that nothing which would happen to a friend of yours could rejoice you more. I wish I had met you earlier. It would have made a difference, a great difference in my life. I did not know that religion meant much of anything. Harold here was of your mind, but he seemed exceptional, a kind of fanatic. I could not keep within sight of him. The other people whom I knew intimately seemed to have very little to do with their religion. I beg your pardon, mother, but that was the way it seemed to me. There are different degrees, I suppose." "Louis, you are talking too much," here interposed Mr. Chesney, as he brought the medicine to administer. "Your pulse is rising." "Never mind, it won't hurt me. It is almost over now. You know that, Chesney, as well as I do. And I have something to say, that for the good of all parties concerned, must be said now. Mother, I want you to know one thing. From words which you let fall yesterday, I have discovered that you have a mistaken idea about one matter. I am going to die, and I am glad of it. I have gone so far downhill that to climb back again, for one so awfully bruised as I am, would be hard, very hard. Perhaps the Lord sees that it would be impossible, and so gives me this easy way. But, Mother, before I go, I want to tell you something which will remove from your mind a false impression. I saw my danger some time ago, and struggled for a way of escape. It was a weak way that I chose. God would not let me build on it. I fancied that if I could have Claire Benedict for my wife, I could be a good and true man. I implored her to help me in this way, and she utterly and hopelessly refused. You know why I am telling you this, but she does not, and I ask her to forgive me. End of chapter 26. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 27 of Interrupted by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27. The Summer's Story. After this, Louis Ansted steadily failed. It had seemed as though he summoned all the strength left in his worn-out body for that one interview wherein he had resolved that his mother should know the truth from his lips. After that, the lamp of life burned lower and lower. He rallied again 2 days afterward, and was locked in with his lawyer, and gave critical attention to business. I imagine that he made important changes in his will, Mr. Chesney said to Claire. I do not know of what character, though I was called in as a witness. I hope he made special provision for his sister Alice. I think that she is likely to disappoint her parents in their schemes, and it might be greatly to her benefit to be independent so far as property is concerned. But Louis kept his own counsel. His lawyer told me that he might be failing in body, but he had never seen him clearer in brain. So there will be no trouble about carrying out whatever he has planned. I did not know, Claire said, that he had property to leave, independent of his parents. Oh, yes, a large estate, willed to him from his grandfather, absolutely in his own right. It is what has helped to ruin him. How good it would be if he could make his money undo, so far as money could, some of the mischief he has done. How could money undo it, my friend? Oh, it couldn't. Still, it might relieve the misery which comes from want. I was thinking just then of poor little Mrs. Simpson and her fatherless baby. I have heard that her husband drank his first glass while in Louis Ansted's employ, and that Louis offered it to him, and he did not like to refuse for fear of giving offense. He died with the delirium tremens, and his wife sold her bedclothes and her shoes to buy food for him at the last. Perhaps she would rather starve than take money from poor Louis. Haven't I heard that he was connected with one of the distilleries? Some of his property is invested in that way, Mr. Chesney answered, startled with the remembrance. I had not thought of it. Poor Alice! I am afraid there is great trouble for her in whatever direction one looks. If Louis leaves his property to her, her father and mother will violently oppose what her intense temperance principles would advocate. I wish Louis had felt like talking these things over with me a little. Well, the day came when they followed the ruined body to the grave. It rested in a costly coffin, and the funeral appointments were such as became large wealth and the habit of lavish expenditure. Later, when the will was read, it appeared that the poor heart had taken counsel of one who makes no mistakes. He had done what he could do to undo wrong. The income from valuable investments was large, and was left in trust to his sister Alice, to be used at her discretion in relieving the woes of those who had been brought low through the influence of intoxicants. As for the distillery, from which half of his income was derived, its business was immediately to cease, its stock was to be destroyed, and its buildings to be made into tenement houses for the poor." "The poor boy was not in his right mind when he made such a will," the father said. "Why, it is a sinful waste. It is simply throwing thousands of dollars into the river." "It is all the influence of that Benedict girl," the mother said in bitterness of spirit. But the will stood, and its directions were obeyed with all the promptness that the sister to whose trust the work was left could force her lawyers. She seemed in feverish haste to have the work of destruction go on. And when her mother accused her of being hopelessly under the influence of that Benedict girl, and having no mind of her own, her answer was, "Mamma, you are mistaken. At last I am under the influence of one who has a right to own me, body and soul. Poor Louis found him at last, and yielded to his power, and followed his direction, and it was through Claire Benedict's influence that he did. And, mamma, if he had known Claire Benedict a few years earlier, we should have him with us today. Mamma, the time has come for me to speak plainly. Religion has been nothing but a name to me until lately. I have not believed in its power. It is Claire Benedict who has shown me my mistake, and helped me to see Christ as a sufficient Savior. I belong to him now for time and eternity, and, mamma, I will never marry a man who does not with his whole heart own Christ as his master, and who is not as intense and fanatical on the temperance question as my brother became." She had always been strong-willed. The mother had been wont to say, somewhat boastfully, that the oldest daughter resembled her in strength of purpose. Human nature is a curious study. What Mrs. Ansted would do had been a matter of extreme solicitude to several people. Mr. Chessney believed that she would make Alice's life miserable, and that she would become Claire Benedict's enemy, and injure her if she could, and that she would withdraw her younger daughters from not only Claire's but their eldest sister's influence, and from the church to which they had become attached. "I do not mean that she will do this in revenge," he said to Claire, "or that she will really intend to injure anybody. She is one of those persons who can make herself believe that she is doing God's service by just such management as this. I am sorry for Alice and for the young girls. It gives me a sense of relief and joy to remember that Louis is forever safe from pitfalls, and yet sometimes I cannot help wishing that he could have lived for a few months longer. He had great influence over his mother. She tried to manage him, and his indolent will allowed himself to be influenced in a wonderful manner, but when he did really rouse, he had great power over his mother." Mrs. Ansted did none of the things which were feared. Instead, she turned suddenly and with apparent loathing from the life which she had heretofore lived. She sent for Claire one morning, greeted her with a burst of tears as her dear child, and declared that she had understood the feeling between Louis and herself. Nothing would have given her greater joy than to have welcomed her into the family. Claire opened her mouth to protest, and then closed it again. If this were the form of cross that she was to bear, it was peculiar, certainly. But why not bear it as well as any other? Of what use to explain again, what the son's own lips had told, that she had utterly refused the honor offered her, that she had never for a moment desired to be received into this family? If the bereaved mother had really succeeded in making herself believe such folly as this, why not let it pass? The grave had closed over the possibility of its ever being realized. It was a strange part to play. To accept without outward protest the position of one who would have been a daughter of the house, to hear herself mentioned as Louis Ansted's intended wife, to ride and walk and talk with the mother, and help her make believe that she would not for the world have thwarted her son's desires. But Claire, after a few attempts at explanation, dropped the effort. The mother did not wish to believe the truth about this or many other things, and therefore closed her eyes to them. She wished also to impress herself and others with the belief that Louis had been in every respect an exemplary and indeed a remarkable young man. She withdrew her connection from the church in town, and united by letter with the one at South Plains, avowedly because dear Louis was interested in it more than in any other church in the world. She imagined plans that he might have had for the church, and called them his, and eagerly worked them out. She adopted the minister and his wife and his children, because she had often heard Louis say that he would rather hear that man preach than to hear Dr. Archer. And once he told her that the minister's little girl had a very sweet face, and was a cunning little witch whom he liked to tease. She turned with something like disgust from the very name of Van Marter, protesting that poor Louis had had a great deal to bear from their advances, and that she had no desire to cultivate their acquaintance further. In all these strange changes in her mother, Alice looked with bewilderment. "She frightens me," she said to Claire one evening. "I don't know what to think. She contradicts every theory of life I ever heard her express. She attributes to Louis graces that he did not possess. She accuses people of injuring him, who really tried to help him, and she adopts as plans of his things of which I know he had not even thought. I do not know my mother at all, and as I said, it frightens me. Is she losing her mind?" Claire had no ready reply to these questionings, for she, too, was puzzled. But Mr. Chesney, as they walked slowly from the house on the hill, discussing once more the strange change in the woman of the world, advanced a theory which Claire adopted, but which was hardly the one to explain to Alice. "I think," said Mr. Chesney, "that she is hushing her conscience. It would like to speak loudly to her, and tell her that she is responsible for a ruined life, and she does not mean to listen to it. She is imagining a life she believes Louis might have lived after the change that came to him on his sick bed, and is making herself believe that he did live it, and that she was and is in hearty accord with it. It is a strange freak of the bewildering human mind, but unless I am mistaken, the woman will not find the peace in it that she is seeking. I think she will have to cry, 'God be merciful to me a sinner,' before her heart will find rest." And then he added one sentence which set Claire's heart into a strange flutter. "Claire, when I see the energy with which she carries out one of her imaginings connected with you, I am very grateful that Louis insisted on my being present at that first interview between you and him, and that I heard the truth from his own lips, for the mother is succeeding in deceiving everyone else." "And I do not know how to help it," Claire said with troubled voice. "It seems a strange thing to be living a falsehood, but when I try to explain to her, she puts me gently aside and acts as though I had not spoken, and others have no right to question me about the truth of her theories." "Except myself. Have I the right? Was it as emphatic a refusal as poor Louis understood it? Believe me, I am not asking merely to satisfy idle curiosity." "There never was anything in it, Mr. Chesney, and there never could have been." The passage of all these and many other events not chronicled here consumed the greater portion of the summer vacation, for Claire Benedict was letting the summer slip from her without going home. Sore had been the trial at first, but a few weeks before the term closed, opportunity had been offered her to teach a summer class of city pupils at prices that were almost equal to her year's salary. What right had she, who wanted to bestow so many luxuries on her mother, to close her eyes to such an opportunity as this, merely because she was homesick for a sight of that mother's face? It had been hard to reconcile the sister, especially, to this new state of things. The gentle mother had long ago learned the lesson that what looked like manifest duty must not be tampered with, no matter how hard to bear. But the hot-hearted young sister refused to see anything in it except an added trial too great to be borne. Many letters had to be written before there was a final reluctant admission that $200 more to depend on, paltry sum though it was, would make a great difference with the mother's winter comforts. The letter in which poor Dora admitted this was blistered with tears, but the sacrifice was made, and the extra term had been well entered upon. There was much outside of the class and the life being lived on the hill to occupy Claire's thoughts. I hope you do not suppose that the work on the part of the girls had been accomplished during a sort of spasm, and that now they were ready to drop back into inaction. Nothing was farther from their thoughts. If you have imagined so, you have not understood how thoroughly some of them had sacrificed in order to do. We never forget that for which we sacrifice. Besides, the habit of thinking first of the church and the various causes which are the tributaries of the church was formed. That the work was to go on was demonstrated in many ways, not the least by the random remarks which came so naturally from the lips of the workers. "Girls," had Ruth Jennings said, when they lingered one morning after prayer meeting, "when we cushion these seats, we shall have to send somebody after the material who can carry the carpet and wall-paper in his mind's eye. It will never do to have a false note put in here to jar this harmony." When we cushion the seats! Claire heard it and laughed softly. Who had said that the seats were ever to be cushioned? But she knew they would be, and that before very long. On another evening Mary Burton had said, "Look here, don't you think our very next thing, or at least one of the next, ought to be a furnace? I don't like those stovepipes, if they are Russia. A furnace would heat more evenly and with less dust, and Bud could manage a furnace as well as he can these stoves." How naturally they talked about their future sacrifices! What would have utterly appalled them a few months before, were spoken of carelessly now as "next things." Ruth Jennings readily assented to the necessity for a furnace, but added, "I don't believe we shall have Bud for engineer. He wants to go to school, did you know it? And what is more, Mrs. Ansted intends to send him. Fanny told me about it last night. She says her mother thinks Louis intended that Bud should have an education, and she wants to carry out all his plans. I did not know that Louis Ansted ever had any such plans, did you?" Then Nettie Burdick, after a thoughtful pause. "Oh, well, girls, if we can't have Bud for engineer, perhaps we can have him to preach for us some day. He told me last night that if he lived he meant to preach, and I believe he will, and preach well, too. Just think of it! Bud a minister!" End of chapter 27. Recording by Trisha G. Chapter 28 of Interrupted by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. A Family Secret. You are not to suppose that during this press of work the moving spirit in it did not have her homesick hours when it seemed to her that she must fly to her mother, and that at once; that she did not have her anxious hours when to provide as she would like for that dear mother and that beautiful young sister seemed a dreary impossibility; that she did not have her discouraged hours when new carpet and frescoing and stained glass windows seemed only vanity of vanities, and the sharp-toned cabinet organ seemed to wheeze loud enough to drive all other improvements out of mind. But there was always this comfort. She was much too busy to brood long or often over thoughts like these. And another thing, weary and disheartened as some rainy evening might find her, there was forever an undertone of thanksgiving about Bud and Harry Matthews not only, but about others as well, not excepting several of the girls, who, though Christians before she knew them, had stepped upon higher planes of thought and action, been revitalized indeed in their Christian life, and would never go back to the follies of the past. Then came the trouble in the Ansted home, and the weeks of waiting and watching, and the final defeat which was still a triumph. During the solemnities of those hours, things which had seemed like trials sank into trivialities, and life grew to her more earnest and solemn than ever before. In all these ways the summer waned, and now changes of various kinds were pending. Harry Matthews was about closing his engagement with the telegraph company to enter upon a secretaryship under his uncle, a position involving grave responsibilities and conscientious stewardship. What joy it was to remember that the new young man was equal to the trust. Bud was to be regularly entered as a pupil at the academy, and his face was radiant. The Ansteds were to stay at South Plains all winter, and the girls were happy over the prospect of uniting with the little church at its coming communion. Mrs. Ansted had subscribed $100 addition to the minister's salary, and told the people that they ought to feel disgraced for not each giving doubly the original amount; that her son Louis, she felt sure, would have taken the matter up had he lived, and she could not rest until she saw it accomplished. Meantime, there was more or less gossip in the town, of course, about affairs with which the people, if they had really stopped to think, had nothing to do. Among other things, there was wonderment as to why Harold Chessney came to South Plains so often. What business was there in this direction which could require so much attention? To be sure, he was one of the directors of the railroad, but this branch of it had not heretofore been considered so important as to need constant looking after by its chief. Also, there were some who thought it very strange that Miss Benedict should receive so many attentions from him, and she was as good as Louis Ansted's widow. Of course that was so, for Mrs. Ansted herself had as good as said so dozens of times. And see how intimate she was with the entire family. Yes, they knew that Harold Chessney was a very particular friend of Louis Ansted, but they should think that would hardly account for such a degree of intimacy, when Louis had only been buried a few weeks. Meantime, the central figures of this anxious talk went their busy ways, and seemed in no sense troubled by the tongues. Harold Chessney came often, and always visited the Ansteds and the academy, and the intimacy between all parties seemed to increase instead of diminish. It was about this time that Claire received an unusually lengthy letter from Dora, a letter over which she laughed much, and also shed some tears. Dora had some family perplexities to ask advice about, and indulged rather more than was her wont over forebodings in regard to the coming winter. Then suddenly she launched into the main channel of her letter after this fashion: "Oh, Claire, my dear, you are good. If I could be half like you, or even 1/3, it would be such a relief to mamma as well as to myself. But Claire, this next that I am going to say is mean and small, and will serve to show you that I have a correct estimate of myself. I cannot help thinking that it would be much easier for me to be good if I were away off in South Plains, or North Mountains, or anywhere else than here, right around the corner from the old home. Do you have any conception of what a difference it makes to be around the corner from things, instead of being on the same street with them? I think it possible that I might throw myself intensely into plans for that North Mountain church, you know, if I were there, and forget this one, and these people, and the old ways. Claire, part of the time I am pretty good. I am indeed. But really and truly it is hard. The girls try to be good too, some of them. Occasionally I think if they did not try so hard, I could get along better. You see, they stop talking about things when I appear, for fear I will be hurt, and I am hurt. But it is because they think I will be foolish enough to care for what they have been saying. Do you understand that? It reads as though there were no sense in it, but I know what I mean. It is clothes half the time. Clothes are dreadful. I find I had no conception of their cost. Not that I am having any new ones. Don't be frightened, dear. I am not so lost to a sense of what has befallen us as such a proceeding would indicate. Why, even a pair of gloves is often beyond my means. Neither am I complaining. It is not the gloves. I am quite willing to go without them. If mamma could have the things which we used to consider necessities for her, I would be willing to go bare-handed for the rest of my days. Well, what am I talking about? Let me see if I can put it into words. The girls, you know, are always arranging for this and that entertainment. I meet them oftener, now that you have insisted on my going back to the music class. To some of these entertainments I am invited, and to more of them I am not. I never go on account of clothes and some other things. Imagine a party of girls gathered in the music room or the hall, in full tide of talk about what they will wear and how they will arrange their hair and their ribbons and all that sort of thing, and imagine a sudden silence settling over them because I have appeared in sight, as though I were a grim fairy before whom it was their misfortune to have to be forever silent about everything that was pretty or cost money. Now I am going to make a confession, and I know it is just as silly as can be, but sometimes I cannot help rushing home, and running up to my room, and locking my door, and crying as though my heart would break. I am thoughtful, though, about choosing times and occasions for these outbreaks. I generally select an afternoon when Mama is out executing some of your numerous commissions. But even then I have to bathe my eyes for half an hour, so that the poor, dear, sweet, patient woman will know nothing about it. I never do let her know, Claire. She thinks that I am good and happy, and occasionally she tells me that I am growing self-controlled like you, and then I feel like a hypocrite. But all the same, for her own good I don't enlighten her. Claire, dear, don't you suppose it is the silly parties to which I do not go which trouble me. I have not the slightest desire to go, and I don't think of them often. I don't, really. Well, that about having no desire needs qualifying. I mean I would not have if I could go. I mean I should like to be perfectly able to go if I chose, and then to choose to remain at home. Do you understand? If the girls would only be free and social, and talk with me as though nothing had happened, I should learn not to care. But it is so hard to always feel that people are saying, "Hush, there she comes, poor thing. Don't talk about it now, or we shall hurt her feelings." I would rather have them drop me entirely, I believe, as Estelle Mitchell has done. She doesn't bow to me any more, even when we meet face to face. Doesn't see me, you know, but she does even that politely. I don't know how she manages. Claire, do you remember the time Papa signed that $10,000 note for her father? Well, never mind. I am writing a silly and a wicked letter. I haven't written so to you before, have I? I'll tell you what has stirred me so lately. Everybody is in a flutter about the house. Claire, it is sold. You know what house I mean, the dear old one on the avenue, every separate stone of which speaks of Papa. That Mr. Chesney bought it, who spends half of his time abroad. There is a rumor that he is to be married sometime, nobody seems to know just when, and bring his bride there to live. It is well for me that I shall not have a chance to move in her circle, for I feel almost certain that I should have to hate her a little. It is very absurd, of course, but the girls are actually beginning already to talk about the possible reception, though they don't even know who the prospective bride is. Some have located her in Chicago, and some in Europe. I cannot discover that there is an absolute certainty about there being any bride, and yet some of the young ladies are planning what would be pretty and unique to wear. Estelle Mitchell is sure of being invited, because her brother Dick used to be quite intimately acquainted with one of the Chesney family, and Dora Benedict is sure of not being invited, because she is not intimately acquainted with anybody any more. I wonder who will have our rooms, our dear old rooms. Yes, that largest blot is a tear. I couldn't help it, and I haven't time to copy, and could not afford to waste the paper if I had. I don't cry very often, but I was foolish enough to walk by the blessed old home this morning, and look up at the open window in Papa's study. Oh, Claire, darling, I wish you could come home, if it is only for a little while, and we could go away from here. Don't you think Mama might be made comfortable in South Plains for the winter? Oh, that is foolish, I know, and you are a dear, brave, self-sacrificing sister to give up your vacation and work away all summer to help support us. Tomorrow I shall not care anything about this, only to be dreadfully ashamed that I sent you this wicked letter. I am going down now to make tea and a bit of cream toast for mother, and I shall be as bright as a gold eagle, and hover around her like a moth miller in the gaslight, and tell her all sorts of pleasant nothings, and never a word of the house, or the sale, or the possible new mistress for the old home. I am learning, dear, though from this letter you might not think it. But I live such a pent-up, everyday life that I have to say things to you once in a while, else what would become of me?" Claire laughed a great deal over this letter, pitiful as the undertone in it must have been to a sympathetic heart. The tears came once or twice, but after all the predominant feeling seemed to be amusement. It was not answered promptly. In fact, she waited 3 days. Then came Mr. Chesney for one of his brief visits, and she read the letter aloud to him. What Dora would have thought, could she have seen that proceeding, passes my imagination. What would she have thought of human sympathy, could she have heard the bursts of laughter over parts of it, albeit Mr. Chesney did once or twice brush away a tear? What would she have thought, could she have heard the conversation which followed? "Now, my dear Claire, I hope you are convinced of your hard-heartedness. Poor Dora ought not to have this strain kept on her during the autumn, especially when it is so utterly unnecessary. The house will be in complete order in a few weeks' time, and Dora's reception is just the thing. I can write to Phillips, and put every arrangement into his hands, and we can appoint Dora manager-in-chief. Claire, I have a plan worth a dozen of yours. Let us have the mother and Dora here for a visit. They want to see the little church which they have helped to build. Nothing could be pleasanter. Then all your girls and all your boys could be present at the ceremony. Think what it would be for Bud. He would never forget it. Neither would this struggling minister. It would afford an excuse for doing for him just what we want to do. The law does not regulate the amount of marriage fees, you know." Mr. Chesney was an eloquent pleader, and Dora's letter, it must be confessed, pled against the delay that Claire had thought was wise. Of course she demurred. Of course she hinted at the plans that she had formed for getting ready. But the party on the opposite side had an answer for every argument. He was sure that the way to do would be to get ready afterward, when she could have leisure and his invaluable presence and advice, instead of being hampered with music scholars, and he miles away, alone, waiting, and Dora waiting and suffering, and the mother thinking her sad thoughts. Happy surprises were all very well. They were delightful. He was entirely in sympathy with her desire to tell Mamma and Dora the story of the new home in person, only he believed with all his heart that it would be cruel, and therefore wrong, to burden that young heart with the question of ways and means a moment longer than was necessary. As for Mrs. Foster, she could supply Claire's place quietly, and thereby make some poor music teacher's heart unexpectedly glad. Of course, Claire was overruled. She had really not one sensible reason to offer why she should remain exiled from Mamma and Dora any longer. There was a little feeling of pride, it is true, about the getting ready afterward. But as she looked it over carefully and prayerfully, it seemed, even to herself, a mean pride, unworthy of the woman who was to be Harold Chesney's wife. Then there was a fascination in the thought of Dora planning for that reception, really being the one to invite whom she would among the girls, instead of being the one left out in the cold. Also, it was pleasant to think what an event it would be to her girls and to Bud, and her cheeks glowed over the thought of the marriage fee that would find its way into the lean pocketbook of the overburdened minister. I would like to tell you the whole story in detail, what Dora said when the letter came imploring her mother and herself to come to South Plains for a few weeks' visit, how the mother demurred on the ground of expense, and yet confessed that it made her heart beat wildly to think of getting her arms around Claire again. "But I cannot think what has become of the dear child's good sense," she would add with a sigh. "Why, Dora dear, she did not come home, you know, because the trip would cost too much, and here she is planning for 2 of us to take it." "Never mind, mamma," would Dora reply, for Dora was desperately determined on this trip to South Plains. "Claire has planned a way, and we shall save our food if we stay 2 weeks, and that will be something, and she has sent us the tickets, so the money is spent. Oh, mamma, let us go, anyway." And of course they went. Yes, I would delight to tell you all about it. What a sensation there was in South Plains, and how full the little church was, and how well Bud looked walking down the aisle as one of the ushers, and how people said the Ansteds certainly would not come, they would feel it a family insult, but how the Ansteds not only came, but took almost entire charge of everything. Above all, I would like to have you look in with me at the parsonage, in the study, where the minister and his wife stopped to break the seal of that special envelope after it was all over. How he rubbed his eyes, and looked again, and turned pale, and said huskily, "There is some mistake here, Mary. He has given me the wrong paper." And how she came and looked over his shoulder, and said, "Why, it has your full name. How can there be a mistake?" And then she read, "Pay to Reverend Henry Ramsey, or order, $1,000. Who ever heard of such a marriage fee as that? Oh, now I have. There have been just such marriage fees as that, really and truly. There had been such before Harold Chesney and Claire Benedict were married, and there will be such again. There are poor ministers, and grand, rich men, and there will be, I presume, while the world stands. More things than some people dream of are going on in this world of ours. There is one thing which it gives me great pleasure to record. There was a reception given in the old home. It was after Mamma and Dora had been established for several days in their old rooms, and it was the evening after the arrival of the bride and groom, and Estelle Mitchell was invited to the reception. Not because her brother Dick had been intimate with one of the Chesneys, but because, "My brother Harold gave me the liberty to invite whoever I pleased among my classmates, and it would give me pleasure to see you there." Dora spoke truth. It really gave her great pleasure to see Estelle Mitchell at the wedding reception of the Chesneys, and to realize that she was her guest. "Oh, you wicked, wicked Dora!" some of them said, when the excitement caused by the reception cards was at its height. "There you heard us talking about the new furniture, and wondering as to who was the bride, and you never gave us so much as a hint." Dora laughed, and kept her own counsel. She did not choose to tell them that during those trying days no hint of it had come to her. That was their pretty family secret, with which outsiders were not to intermeddle. They agreed, every one of them, that Dora made a charming young hostess. And Estelle Mitchell said she was glad she was back in her old home, for she just fitted. There are but 2 things which remain to tell you. One grew out of Ruth Jennings's farewell address to her beloved music teacher, spoken while she was half laughing, half crying, and wholly heartbroken. "But the organ does squeak horribly, you know it does, and it is always getting out of tune." Mr. Chesney heard it, and during their wedding trip he said to his wife, "There is one thing I want you to help me select. I have not made my thank offering yet to that blessed little church where I found you. It must have an organ that will keep in tune, and that will worthily commemorate the harmony that was begun there." Imagine, please, for I shall not attempt to tell you, the delight, to say nothing of the unspeakable wonder, of the girls, and of the entire community, when the beautifully finished, exquisitely toned bit of mechanism was set up in the church. Accompanying it were 2 organ stools, one for the church and one for Ruth Jennings's home. So she sits on dictionaries and patent office reports no more. The other item can be told more briefly. It is embodied in a sentence which the gentle mother spoke one morning at the breakfast table. "By the way, Claire, the committee about the mission band entertainment was here yesterday while you and Harold were out, to see if you would help them. I told them I thought you would." The face of the bride flushed deeply, and a peculiarly tender light shone in her eyes as she said: "How very strange that is! It is the same band which was preparing for that exercise about which I told you. We were to have had it on the day in which papa was buried." "It is the same exercise," Dora said, speaking gently. "The girls dropped it entirely, and could never persuade themselves to take hold of it again, until last week they voted to attempt it." "You were only interrupted in your work, you see," Mr. Chesney said, smiling down on eyes that were filling with tears. "Interrupted, that you might set some wheels in motion that had been clogged. Now you are called back to finish the other, and I am here to help you." End of Chapter 28. Recording by Trisha G. End of Interrupted, by Pansy.